History remembers the winners, the builders, the moments when humanity reached for the stars. But there's another story that runs like a dark thread through the tapestry of human experience. The story of when everything went wrong. This is not a celebration of human achievement. This is an account of 25 moments when the world collapsed, when millions died, and when the very foundations of civilization cracked under the weight of disaster. From the mysterious Bronze Age collapse that ended an entire era to World War II, these are the chapters history would rather forget. The Plague of Athens, 430 to 426 BC. In the ancient world, no one understood disease better than doctors believed they did. Physicians studied the balance of bodily humours, prescribed herbal remedies, and confidently explained illness as divine punishment or natural imbalance. They had never encountered anything like what arrived in Athens during the second summer of the Peloponnesian War. This is not a story about statistics or political consequences. This is about what it felt like to watch your world die, one person at a time. Thucydides was there. The Athenian general and historian lived through the plague that consumed his city, and he wrote down what he witnessed with the precision of a medical examiner and the soul of a survivor. His account, preserved for over 2,000 years, reads like a trauma victim trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. He begins his description not with grand historical context, but with something more immediate, the moment when everything familiar became terrifying. The illness, Thucydides tells us, came from the south. Ships arriving from Egypt and Libya brought more than trade goods to the port of Piraeus. Sailors stumbled off vessels burning with fever, their skin erupting in pustules, their breath reeking of infection. Within days, the disease had spread through the harbour district like wildfire through dry grass. But Athens in 430 BC was not prepared for what came next. Pericles, the great Athenian leader, had ordered the entire population of the countryside to retreat behind the city's protective walls. His strategy seemed brilliant. Let the Spartans ravage the empty fields while Athens remained safe, supplied by its powerful navy. What he had created instead was the perfect breeding ground for catastrophe. Tens of thousands of refugees crowded into a city designed for far fewer people. They slept in temples, in makeshift shelters, in any space they could find. When plague arrived in this overcrowded pressure cooker, it found ideal conditions. Thucydides describes the onset of symptoms with clinical detachment that barely conceals his horror. It began, he writes, with violent heat in the head and burning in the eyes. The throat and tongue became blood red and emitted an unnatural and fetid breath. Sneezing and hoarseness followed, and soon the chest was affected with violent coughing. When the disease settled in the stomach, it produced intense vomiting and severe diarrhea. The skin broke out in small pustules and ulcers, but the internal fever was so intense that victims could not bear even the lightest clothing. They threw themselves into cold water cisterns, desperate for relief. But beyond the physical symptoms lay something worse, the complete unpredictability of who would live and who would die. Thucydides notes that the plague showed no respect for age, gender, or social status. It killed the strong and spared the weak, took children while leaving elderly parents to mourn, destroyed entire households while inexplicably passing over their neighbours. Doctors died faster than their patients, infected through their attempts to help. The randomness was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. A young woman named in the records only as the daughter of Callias watched her entire family succumb within a week. Her father, a prominent citizen who had served as ambassador to Sparta, fell ill first. His fever climbed so high that he tore off his clothes and ran naked through the streets, begging for cold water. Her mother tried to care for him, bathing his burning skin with wet cloths, forcing him to drink. Within 3 days, she too was delirious with fever. The younger children followed one by one until only the daughter remained in a house full of corpses. The normal rhythm of Athenian life collapsed. Religious festivals ceased because there were not enough healthy participants. The agora, usually bustling with merchants and citizens, became eerily quiet except for the constant passage of funeral processions. Traditional burial practices broke down under the sheer volume of death. Families who had followed ancient rituals for generations found themselves burning their dead on strangers' pyres or throwing bodies into mass graves. Thucydides witnessed scenes that violated everything Athens claimed to represent. He saw people stealing funeral pyres from others, placing their own dead on fires intended for different families. He watched as sacred burial laws fundamental to Greek civilization crumbled before practical necessity. The city that prided itself on order and rational discourse descended into a kind of moral chaos, where survival trumped all other considerations. One physician, mentioned in contemporary records as Acron of Agrigentum, travelled from Sicily specifically to help fight the plague. He had successfully treated similar diseases in other cities and arrived in Athens confident in his abilities. According to the accounts, he worked tirelessly visiting the sick, administering treatments, refusing to abandon his patients even as other doctors fled the city. The plague killed him within 2 weeks of his arrival, just another casualty in a disaster that seemed to mock human knowledge and courage. The social fabric began to tear in ways that shocked even seasoned observers. People stopped planning for the future, Thucydides notes, because they expected to die before any long-term goals could be achieved. Crime increased as people decided that immediate pleasure mattered more than consequences they might not live to face. Traditional respect for authority eroded as citizens watched their leaders die as helplessly as anyone else. Yet amid the horror, Thucydides also records moments of extraordinary human decency. He tells of individuals who, having survived the plague and gained apparent immunity, dedicated themselves to caring for the still afflicted. These survivors, knowing they could not catch the disease again, became the backbone of whatever medical care remained in the city. They fed the sick, carried water to the feverish, and performed the basic acts of human kindness that kept Athens from complete collapse. Pericles himself fell victim to the plague in 429 BC, though his death came after months of watching his political vision crumble along with his city's population. The great strategist who had promised Athens could wait out any siege found himself helpless against an enemy that recognized no walls, respected no treaties, and could not be defeated by superior tactics or naval power. His final speeches, according to Thucydides, showed a man grappling with the incomprehensible scale of loss. The plague created its own rhythm of hope and despair. Families would celebrate when a loved one's fever broke, only to watch them succumb to secondary infections days later. Temporary recoveries gave way to relapses that proved fatal. The disease seemed almost malicious in its unpredictability, offering false hope before delivering final blows. Survivors described living in a constant state of anticipation, never knowing whether each day would bring recovery or death. Religious life in Athens fractured under the strain. Traditional sacrifices and prayers seemed worthless against a disease that killed the pious and impious with equal enthusiasm. Some citizens turned to foreign gods and mysterious cults, hoping that different divine powers might prove more effective. Others abandoned religion entirely, concluding that the gods either did not exist or did not care about human suffering. The plague fundamentally changed how Athenians understood their place in the world. The city that had celebrated human reason and achievement found itself humbled by a microscopic enemy beyond the comprehension of their greatest philosophers. The democracy that prided itself on citizen participation struggled to function when a significant portion of the citizenry was either dead or too sick to participate in governance. Thucydides survived, possibly because he contracted a milder form of the disease that granted him immunity. His account suggests that he felt a responsibility to record what he had witnessed, to preserve the memory of both the suffering and the occasional nobility he had observed. His descriptions serve as one of the earliest and most detailed accounts of pandemic disease, but they also stand as testament to the human capacity to find meaning even in the midst of inexplicable loss. The Bronze Age collapse, 1200 to 1150 BC. Picture this: the Mediterranean Sea in the year 1300 BC. Merchant ships sail between bustling ports, carrying precious metals, ivory and spices. Palace scribes in Greece carefully record grain stores on clay tablets using an ancient script called Linear B. In what is now Turkey, Hittite kings rule from their magnificent capital of Hattusha, commanding an empire that stretches across Anatolia. Egyptian pharaohs boast of their wealth in golden temples along the Nile. This is the Late Bronze Age, a time when civilization has reached heights not seen before in human history. Trade networks span continents. Tin from Afghanistan mixes with copper from Cyprus to create bronze tools and weapons that revolutionize warfare and agriculture. Mycenaean Greeks build massive stone palaces at Pylos, Tiryns and Mycenae, their walls so thick that later generations will call them the work of giants. The Hittites have mastered ironworking, giving them military advantages that keep their enemies at bay. Egyptian records speak of diplomatic marriages between royal houses, peace treaties written on silver tablets, and tribute flowing from distant lands. Baltic amber finds its way south to Mediterranean palaces, exchanged for bronze weapons and luxury goods. Mesopotamian merchants travel established routes that connect Babylon to the Atlantic shores of Spain. Ships carry not just goods but ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that create a shared Bronze Age world. Palace bureaucrats in different kingdoms use similar accounting methods. Artists across the region develop comparable styles. Warriors wear bronze armour crafted using techniques that spread from workshop to workshop. The port city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast becomes a crucial hub in this international network. Its merchants speak multiple languages and use different scripts depending on their trading partners. Clay tablets found in Ugarit's ruins contain correspondence in Akkadian with Mesopotamian cities, in Egyptian hieroglyphs with pharaonic courts, and in Hittite with Anatolian kingdoms. The city's warehouses store goods from across the known world, waiting to be shipped to distant markets. But beneath this golden age, cracks begin to show. Clay tablets from Pylos speak of coastal watchers being posted, as if the palace officials expect trouble from the sea. The wording is urgent, almost desperate. Guards are stationed at remote outposts with orders to light beacon fires at the first sign of enemy ships. Hittite records mention increasing raids along their borders, describing attackers who fight with unfamiliar tactics and seem to have no permanent homeland. Egyptian inscriptions grow more urgent, describing strange peoples moving across the Mediterranean in great numbers, bringing their families and possessions as if fleeing something terrible. These mysterious groups, later called the Sea Peoples by modern historians, seem to be running from disaster, but they bring destruction wherever they land. Their ships carry not just warriors but entire populations, suggesting mass migrations driven by forces beyond human control. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals climate data that tells a troubling story. Pollen samples from lake beds show dramatic changes in vegetation patterns around 1200 BC. Drought becomes widespread across the eastern Mediterranean. Rivers that have flowed for centuries begin to dry up. Crops fail repeatedly. The complex agricultural systems that support Bronze Age populations start breaking down. Around 1200 BC, the warning signs explode into catastrophe. The Great Palace at Pylos burns so fiercely that the clay tablets in its archives are accidentally fired, preserving them for archaeologists to find thousands of years later. But the scribes who wrote them are gone forever. The final Linear B tablets speak of emergency measures, of bronze being collected for weapons, of men being sent to distant posts who never return. At Tiryns, massive walls that have stood for centuries are torn down stone by stone. The citadel of Mycenae, legendary home of King Agamemnon, is abandoned after its destruction. The site shows clear evidence of violent assault, with arrowheads and spear points found scattered among the ruins. The palace's Megaron, its great hall where kings once held court, becomes a pile of rubble that will not be disturbed for over 1,000 years. Far to the east, Hattusha faces its final days. The Hittite capital, once home to tens of thousands, goes up in flames that burn so hot they melt bronze artifacts and crack massive stone foundations. The destruction is so complete that the city is never rebuilt. Cuneiform tablets buried in the ruins speak of desperate final days, of enemies at the gates, of a kingdom fighting for its life and losing. The great library of Hattusha, containing thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, becomes ash and debris. The Sea Peoples, meanwhile, sweep down the Mediterranean coast like a human tsunami. The wealthy trading city of Ugarit, which has prospered for centuries as a meeting point between civilizations, is utterly destroyed around 1190 BC. Recent excavations show that the city's destruction was sudden and complete. Valuables were left scattered in houses as if people fled without time to gather their possessions. The city's port facilities, crucial to Mediterranean trade, are demolished so thoroughly that they cannot be rebuilt. City after city falls before the Sea Peoples. Some places are burned and abandoned, their populations killed or scattered to become refugees themselves. Others are taken over entirely, their previous inhabitants replaced by the newcomers who established different cultures, different ways of life. The pattern repeats across the eastern Mediterranean. prosperity turns to ash, order becomes chaos, civilization retreats into darkness. Only Egypt manages to turn them back, but even the mighty pharaohs are weakened by the effort. Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu depicts massive sea and land battles against the invaders. The reliefs show Egyptian forces desperately fighting off seaborne invasions, while their own territories suffer from the disruption of trade and the strain of constant warfare. Egypt survives, but its golden age ends with these conflicts. What follows is unlike anything the ancient world has experienced. Trade routes that took centuries to establish vanish overnight. Ships no longer sail between distant ports because the ports themselves have been destroyed or abandoned. The knowledge of writing disappears in Greece for over 400 years, creating what historians call a dark age. People abandon the great cities and retreat to small hilltop settlements, scratching out a living as farmers and herders. The population drops dramatically, where once great palaces coordinated the activities of thousands of workers, craftsmen and administrators, now village chiefs struggle to feed a few dozen families. The specialized occupations that characterize Bronze Age society, the metalworkers, scribes, artists and merchants, disappear. People return to subsistence farming, making their own tools and growing their own food. The bronze-making industry collapses because the trade networks that brought tin and copper together no longer exist. Tin deposits are rare and geographically distant from copper sources, requiring extensive trade networks to combine these metals into bronze. Iron becomes more common, not because of technological advancement, but because iron ore can be found locally while bronze requires international commerce that no longer functions. Art becomes simpler, cruder. The magnificent frescoes and golden treasures of the Bronze Age palaces are replaced by rough pottery and simple tools. The sophisticated artistic traditions that had developed over centuries are lost as the craftsmen who maintained them are killed, displaced, or forced to abandon their specializations to survive. In some regions, people forget how their ancestors lived. The massive ruins of Mycenaean palaces become the stuff of legend, inspiring stories of heroes and giants that will eventually become the myths told by Homer. The Greeks of later centuries, seeing these enormous stone structures, cannot believe that ordinary humans built them. They create elaborate mythologies to explain the ruins, giving birth to stories that will survive long after the historical truth is forgotten. The Hittites, once rulers of a great empire that rivaled Egypt in power and influence, fragment into small city-states that struggle to remember their former glory. The unified Hittite identity dissolves as isolated communities develop their own local cultures and lose connection with their imperial past. The collapse is not uniform across all regions. Some areas, particularly those less dependent on long-distance trade, recover faster than others. But the interconnected world of the late Bronze Age is gone forever. It will take centuries for Mediterranean civilizations to rebuild trade networks, develop new writing systems, and create political structures complex enough to support large populations again. Archaeological evidence shows the scale of destruction across multiple regions. At site after site across Greece, Turkey, and the Levant, excavators find the same pattern, a layer of ash and debris marking the end of Bronze Age occupation, followed by either complete abandonment or much simpler settlements. The contrast is stark and unmistakable. Below the destruction layer, archaeologists find evidence of wealth, sophistication, and international connections. Above it, they find the remains of people struggling just to survive. Recent studies using paleoclimate data suggest that a severe drought lasting over 300 years may have triggered or accelerated these events. Pollen analysis from sites across the eastern Mediterranean shows dramatic changes in vegetation patterns, indicating prolonged periods of insufficient rainfall. Agricultural systems that had supported dense populations for centuries suddenly could no longer feed the people who depended on them. The Antonine plague, 165 to 180 AD. Sometimes history turns on the decision to break open a single door. In the winter of 165 AD, Roman soldiers under the command of co-emperor Lucius Verus stood before the gates of Seleucia, a wealthy Mesopotamian city on the banks of the Tigris River. The siege had dragged on for months as part of Rome's campaign against the Parthian Empire. When the city finally fell, Roman legions poured through its streets, looting temples and palaces with the methodical efficiency that had built an empire. But in one temple, according to later accounts, soldiers discovered a sealed chamber that local priests had warned should never be opened. The Romans, dismissing such superstitions, broke down the door anyway. What emerged was not treasure, but something far more dangerous, a disease that would bring the mighty Roman Empire to its knees. The plague that emerged from Seleucia spread with terrifying speed through the Roman army. Soldiers who had been celebrating victory found themselves burning with fever within days. The symptoms were unlike anything military physicians had encountered. Men developed severe headaches and high fevers, their skin erupting in dark pustules that covered their entire bodies. Diarrhea and vomiting left them weak and dehydrated. Many developed severe coughs that brought up blood. The Roman physician Galen, who would later give his name to this plague, documented cases where soldiers appeared to recover, only to die suddenly from internal bleeding. But the disease did not remain confined to the army. Roman military camps were never isolated entities. They depended on local populations for supplies, services, and support. Camp followers, merchants, and local civilians who had dealings with the soldiers began falling ill. Within weeks, the plague had spread from military camps into nearby cities and towns throughout Mesopotamia. Trade routes that connected these urban centres became highways of death, carrying infected merchants and their goods to previously healthy communities. The Roman military machine that had conquered the known world became the perfect vehicle for pandemic spread. As news of victories reached Rome, legions began their journey home, following well-established routes that connected the eastern provinces with the heart of the empire. Sick soldiers travelled alongside healthy ones, sharing tents, food, and water sources. Those who died along the way were buried in shallow graves beside major roads, but their comrades continued westward, carrying the infection with them. By 166 AD, the plague had reached the major port cities of the eastern Mediterranean. Alexandria, the great centre of learning and commerce, saw ships arriving with crews too sick to work. Cargo vessels designed to carry grain to feed Rome instead brought death to every port they visited. The sophisticated trade networks that were Rome's greatest strength became the plague's most effective ally. Ships that normally carried goods between Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt now transported infection across the Mediterranean Sea. The disease struck Rome itself in 166 AD, arriving through multiple routes simultaneously. Returning soldiers brought it overland through the Balkans. Merchant ships carried it into Roman ports. Even diplomatic missions from eastern provinces unknowingly transported the plague to the capital. Within months, the disease had spread throughout the Italian peninsula. Rural communities that had never seen foreign soldiers found themselves facing the same plague that had decimated armies in distant Mesopotamia. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, watched his empire transform from the pinnacle of human achievement into a landscape of suffering. The plague disrupted every aspect of Roman life. In the countryside, farmers abandoned their fields as entire families succumbed to disease. Food production collapsed just as urban populations needed more resources to care for the sick. The carefully balanced system that moved grain from Egypt and North Africa to feed Rome's million inhabitants began to break down. The Roman military, the backbone of imperial power, suffered catastrophic losses. Entire legions were decimated not by enemy action but by disease. The plague showed no respect for military rank or experience. Veteran centurions who had served for decades died alongside fresh recruits. The systematic training and discipline that made Roman armies invincible meant nothing against an enemy that attacked from within. Marcus Aurelius found himself forced to recruit slaves, gladiators, and barbarians to fill the gaps in his forces. Along the northern frontiers, Germanic tribes recognized Roman weakness and began probing for opportunities. The Marcomannic Wars erupted in 167 AD as various tribal confederations launched coordinated attacks against plague-weakened Roman defences. What should have been routine frontier skirmishes became existential threats to Roman territories. The emperor who had hoped to spend his reign in philosophical contemplation found himself commanding armies while battling a disease that respected no boundaries. The plague's economic impact created cascading failures throughout the empire. Trade relationships built over centuries collapsed as cities quarantined themselves or simply lacked healthy populations to maintain commerce. The Roman tax system, which depended on predictable agricultural and commercial production, faced massive shortfalls. Provincial governors reported entire districts where tax collection had become impossible because there were not enough survivors to pay. Urban centres that had been showcases of Roman civilization became places of horror. Rome itself, with its dense population and constant flow of visitors, experienced mortality rates that overwhelmed traditional burial practices. The city's elaborate funeral customs, which reinforced social hierarchies even in death, gave way to mass cremations and common graves. Bodies piled up faster than they could be processed, creating additional health hazards that compounded the original plague. Co-Emperor Lucius Verus, who had commanded the armies that first encountered the plague, died in 169 AD, likely from the disease he had helped unleash. His death marked the end of the dual leadership structure that had worked effectively for Rome. Marcus Aurelius, left to rule alone, struggled to maintain control over an empire where communication systems had broken down, military units were under strength, and provincial administration was failing. The plague revealed the fundamental vulnerability of Rome's interconnected system. The same roads that moved legions efficiently also carried disease rapidly across vast distances. The urban planning that concentrated populations for economic efficiency created perfect conditions for epidemic spread. The trade networks that brought prosperity also ensured that no region could remain isolated from catastrophe. Religious and philosophical systems that had provided meaning and stability to Roman citizens proved inadequate to explain or combat the plague. Traditional Roman religion, with its emphasis on proper rituals and divine favour, seemed powerless against a disease that killed the pious and impious alike. Even Stoic philosophy, Marcus Aurelius's own intellectual foundation, offered limited comfort to people watching their loved ones die horrible deaths. The plague fundamentally altered Roman demographics in ways that would influence the empire's future development. Some regions lost up to 30% of their population. Rural areas, already struggling with labour shortages, could no longer support previous agricultural output. Cities that had grown beyond their natural carrying capacity shrank dramatically. The plague essentially reset Roman population patterns, creating long-term economic and social changes that would persist for generations. By 180 AD, the plague had run its course, burning through susceptible populations until it lacked sufficient hosts to maintain itself. But the Roman Empire that emerged was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before 165 AD. The confident, expansionist power that had seemed destined to rule the world indefinitely had been humbled by an invisible enemy that recognized no borders, respected no authority, and could not be defeated by superior military tactics or organizational efficiency. The Justinian Plague, 541 to 549 AD. Time was running out for the Byzantine Empire, though no one could have known it in the spring of 541 AD. In the Egyptian port of Pelusium, where the Nile meets the Mediterranean Sea, dock workers began noticing dead rats scattered around the grain warehouses. First dozens, then hundreds, their bodies piling up faster than sanitation crews could remove them. Harbour officials dismissed it as a minor nuisance, perhaps spoiled grain or seasonal changes affecting the local rodent population. But the rats were not dying from hunger or poison, they were dying from plague, and their fleas were already seeking new hosts. Within weeks, the first human cases appeared among the stevedores and sailors who worked the docks. High fevers struck suddenly, followed by painful swellings in the groin and armpits that grew to the size of apples. The victims developed black pustules across their skin, gave off a terrible stench, and many fell into delirium before death. Local physicians tried traditional remedies, bloodletting, herbal treatments, prayers to various gods, but nothing worked. The mysterious disease seemed to mock every attempt at treatment. By summer 541, ships departing Pelusium carried more than grain. Hidden in their cargo holds, infected fleas travelled on rats that had already begun their own countdown to death. The Byzantine Empire's greatest strength, its extensive trade networks that connected Egypt's grain surplus to Constantinople's hungry population, became the mechanism of its destruction. Every ship that left Egyptian ports carried death toward the heart of the empire. The plague followed the grain route with mechanical precision. Alexandria fell first, its massive population providing ideal conditions for the disease to spread. From there, infected ships sailed to Cyprus, then Rhodes, then the ports of Asia Minor. Each stop created a new centre of infection that would spread outward into the surrounding countryside. The Byzantine bureaucracy, famous for its record-keeping, began documenting what seemed like isolated outbreaks, unaware that they were tracking the approach of catastrophe. Emperor Justinian, busy with his dreams of reconquering the former Roman Empire, initially dismissed reports of disease in distant provinces. His armies were winning victories in Italy and North Africa. His legal reforms were reshaping Byzantine society. His architectural projects, including the magnificent Hagia Sophia, demonstrated imperial power and Christian devotion. The emperor who believed God had chosen him to restore Roman greatness could not imagine that his empire was about to face its greatest test. By autumn 541, the plague had reached the major ports of the eastern Mediterranean. Thessalonica reported massive mortality among its merchant population. Ships arriving in Constantinople's harbours began reporting sick crew members, though port authorities initially attributed this to normal hazards of sea travel. The imperial administration, focused on military campaigns and legal reforms, failed to recognise the pattern emerging across their territories. The first systematic attempt to prevent disaster came from Procopius, the court historian who would later record the plague's devastation. He observed the correlation between ship arrivals and disease outbreaks, urging officials to inspect vessels more carefully and quarantine sick crew members. His warnings were noted, filed, and largely ignored by administrators who had more pressing concerns than the theoretical musings of a court intellectual. As winter approached, Byzantine medical authorities finally recognized they faced something unprecedented. Palace physicians, led by court doctors trained in Greek medical traditions, attempted to develop treatment protocols. They tried everything their ancient texts recommended, balancing bodily humours through bleeding and purging, administering complex herbal mixtures, even surgical removal of the characteristic swellings. Each method failed spectacularly. The disease killed patients regardless of treatment, social status, or religious devotion. Desperate to protect the capital, imperial officials ordered the first quarantine measures in Constantinople's history. Ships from infected provinces were to anchor in designated areas outside the main harbour. Crew members showing symptoms were to be isolated on a small island in the Bosphorus. Special burial grounds were established outside the city walls for plague victims. These precautions might have worked against a normal epidemic, but they were implemented too late and with too little understanding of how the disease actually spread. Spring 542 brought the plague to Constantinople with devastating force. Procopius, who witnessed the disaster firsthand, recorded that the disease killed up to 10,000 people per day at its peak. The imperial administration, which had functioned efficiently for decades, began breaking down under the strain. Tax collectors died before completing their rounds. Military recruiters found provinces too decimated to provide soldiers. Even the palace guards suffered massive casualties. Justinian himself fell ill with plague in the summer of 542, creating a succession crisis that paralysed the empire's response to the disaster. For weeks, the emperor lay near death while his officials struggled to maintain order without clear leadership. Government functions that required imperial approval simply stopped. Military campaigns were abandoned as generals recalled troops to protect their own territories. The great project of Roman restoration ground to a halt. The emperor's recovery seemed miraculous to his subjects, but it came too late to prevent the plague spread throughout the empire. By 543, the disease had reached Britain in the west and India in the east. The sophisticated communication networks that allowed Byzantine administrators to coordinate activities across vast distances now served only to document the empire's destruction. Province after province reported the same story: massive mortality, economic collapse, and social breakdown. Religious authorities, initially confident that prayer and penance would end God's punishment, found their own institutions crumbling. Monasteries that had preserved learning for centuries lost entire communities to disease. Churches that had served as centres of community life became morgues where bodies awaited burial. The theological certainty that had sustained Byzantine Christianity gave way to desperate searches for explanations and solutions. By 544, even the most optimistic officials recognized that traditional responses had failed completely. The empire that had seemed poised to reclaim its former glory was now struggling to maintain basic governmental functions. Provinces declared independence when Constantinople could no longer provide military protection. Trade networks that had generated imperial wealth for centuries collapsed as merchants died or abandoned their routes. The plague's final surge came in 545 to 546, when a second wave struck regions that had begun recovering from the initial outbreak. This time, there were no attempts at organised response. The imperial bureaucracy that had once governed an empire stretching from Spain to Mesopotamia could barely maintain order in Constantinople itself. Justinian's dreams of Roman restoration were buried under mass graves that surrounded every major city in his reduced empire. The year the sun disappeared, 536 AD. Imagine waking up one morning to find the sun has been dimmed to little more than a pale disk in the sky. The light that reaches Earth feels weak, cold, unable to warm your skin or cast proper shadows. This is not an eclipse that will pass in minutes or hours. This is a darkness that will last for 18 months, transforming the world into a twilight realm where nothing grows as it should. For people living in 536 AD across Europe, Asia and the Americas, this became their terrifying reality. But what caused the sun to disappear? The Byzantine historian Procopius, writing from Constantinople, recorded his bewilderment at what he witnessed. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during this whole year. He had no framework to understand what he was seeing. In Italy, the Roman senator Cassiodorus wrote of a summer without warmth, and noted that the sun appeared blue, casting no shadows. From Ireland, the annals record a failure of bread from 536 to 539. Chinese chroniclers documented unusually cold weather and crop failures. Korean records speak of drought and famine. These scattered accounts from across the globe would puzzle historians for centuries. For over 1,000 years, the mystery deepened. Medieval chroniclers attributed the darkness to divine wrath. Renaissance scholars proposed astronomical explanations involving unusual planetary alignments. Enlightenment thinkers suggested massive forest fires or atmospheric anomalies. Each generation of scholars offered theories, but none could explain how a single event could simultaneously affect civilizations separated by thousands of miles. The breakthrough came in the 1980s when climatologists began analysing ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica. Trapped within ancient ice, they found layers of volcanic sulfuric acid dating precisely to 536 AD. The chemical signature was unmistakable. A massive volcanic eruption had injected enormous quantities of sulfur compounds into the atmosphere. These particles acted like a global mirror, reflecting sunlight back into space and plunging the planet into what scientists now call a volcanic winter. But which volcano? The ice core evidence pointed to multiple eruptions occurring in rapid succession. Modern research has identified at least 3 major volcanic events between 536 and 547 AD. The first and largest eruption, which occurred in early 536, likely originated in Iceland or possibly Indonesia. This was followed by additional eruptions in 540 and 547, creating a decade of climatic chaos unprecedented in recorded history. The volcanic explosions sent millions of tons of ash and sulfur compounds into the stratosphere, where high-altitude winds distributed the particles across the entire northern hemisphere. Unlike lower atmospheric pollution that settles relatively quickly, these stratospheric particles remained suspended for years, creating a persistent veil that dimmed the sun and reflected its heat back into space. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius, triggering the most severe climate crisis of the past 2 millennia. The effects began immediately and cascaded through human civilization like dominoes falling in slow motion. Crops across Europe failed as the shortened growing season and reduced sunlight made agriculture nearly impossible. Tree ring evidence from this period shows virtually no growth in 536 and 537, indicating that even the hardiest plant species struggled to survive. In China, snow fell in August. In Europe, summer frost killed crops that had managed to sprout in the dim light. Famine followed crop failure with mathematical precision. Populations that had grown accustomed to reliable harvests suddenly faced starvation on a continental scale. The careful balance between food production and population that had sustained medieval societies collapsed within a single growing season. In many regions, people ate bark, roots, and anything else that might provide sustenance. Contemporary accounts describe entire villages abandoned as inhabitants fled in search of food that no longer existed. The climate catastrophe weakened human immune systems just as new diseases emerged to exploit the vulnerability. The Justinian plague, which had begun spreading through the Byzantine Empire in 541, found populations already stressed by years of malnutrition and climatic chaos. The combination of volcanic winter and pandemic created a perfect storm of human misery. Weakened by hunger, people had little resistance to plague when it arrived in their communities. Social and political structures crumbled under the dual assault of climate and disease. The kingdom of the Ostrogoths in Italy, already struggling with Byzantine reconquest, faced complete collapse as their agricultural base disappeared. Merovingian Gaul descended into civil war as regional leaders fought over dwindling resources. In Britain, Anglo-Saxon expansion accelerated as desperate populations migrated in search of viable farmland. The volcanic winter created feedback loops that amplified its own effects. As crops failed and forests died, less carbon dioxide was absorbed from the atmosphere. Abandoned farmland reverted to wilderness, but the vegetation that grew back was different from what had existed before. Entire ecosystems shifted as species that could tolerate the altered climate replaced those that could not adapt quickly enough. Archaeological evidence reveals the scope of demographic collapse. Settlement patterns across northern Europe show widespread abandonment of marginal farmland. Population centres that had thrived for centuries simply vanished from the historical record. In Scandinavia, entire regions were depopulated as inhabitants either died or migrated south in search of better conditions. The social disruption was so severe that it marks the beginning of what historians call the early medieval crisis. The disaster's global reach demonstrates how interconnected Earth's climate system had become even in the ancient world. Volcanic ash in the atmosphere affected weather patterns worldwide, creating droughts in some regions and floods in others. The El Niño and La Niña cycles that normally regulate Pacific weather were disrupted for years. Monsoon patterns that billions of people depended on shifted dramatically, causing agricultural failures from India to Mexico. Modern climate science has revealed the precise mechanisms that made 536 such a devastating year. Computer models show how volcanic particles in the stratosphere created a feedback loop of cooling. As temperatures dropped, more of the Earth's surface became covered with reflective snow and ice, which reflected even more sunlight back into space. Ocean currents that normally transport heat around the globe were disrupted, extending and amplifying the cooling effect. What makes the 536 event particularly terrifying from a modern perspective is how quickly it developed and how long it lasted. Unlike gradual climate changes that give ecosystems and human societies time to adapt, the volcanic winter struck with stunning suddenness. Within months, agricultural systems that had supported millions of people became completely unviable. The resilience that modern civilization believes it possesses would face its ultimate test in such conditions. Tree ring analysis shows that some regions took decades to recover fully from the 536 event. The oak forests of northern Europe bear scars in their growth patterns that are still visible today, nearly 1,500 years later. Ice core data indicates that it took until approximately 550 AD for atmospheric conditions to return to something approaching normal, meaning that an entire generation grew up in a world defined by volcanic winter. The 536 catastrophe reshaped human civilization in ways that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. The population collapse it triggered altered the balance of power between different ethnic groups and kingdoms. The agricultural crisis accelerated the transition from Roman-style large estates to the smaller, more localized farming systems that would characterize medieval Europe. The breakdown of long-distance trade networks fragmented the intellectual and cultural unity that had characterized late antiquity. The 1556 Shaanxi earthquake. Some disasters announce themselves with warnings that everyone can see. Others strike like lightning from a clear sky, giving no one time to prepare, no chance to escape, no opportunity to say goodbye. At midnight on January 23, 1556, in the Chinese province of Shaanxi, hundreds of thousands of people went to sleep in their beds, in their cave dwellings carved into the region's soft loess hills, in their homes built of unreinforced brick and wood. Most would never wake up. What followed was not just the deadliest earthquake in recorded history, but a human tragedy told through individual stories of loss, survival, and the terrible randomness of who lives and who dies when the earth itself turns into an enemy. Chinchera was one of the lucky ones, though he would never describe his experience that way. A respected scholar who had passed the highest imperial examinations, Qin lived in Weinan, one of the cities that would be completely destroyed in the coming minutes. He was studying late by lamplight when the first tremor hit. At first, he thought it was nothing more than a heavy cart passing on the street outside. Then his writing desk began to shake violently, his inkwell toppled over, and the wooden beams of his house started creaking in ways that filled him with sudden terror. What Qin experienced next, he would later describe in meticulous detail, creating one of the most complete eyewitness accounts of a major earthquake in Chinese history. The ground, he wrote, moved like ocean waves. The sound was indescribable. Not just the cracking of wood and stone, but a deep rumbling that seemed to come from the centre of the earth itself. His house swayed so violently that he could not remain standing. Books flew from their shelves, furniture crashed across rooms, and outside his windows he could see other buildings collapsing in clouds of dust and debris. But Qin's survival came down to a single decision that saved his life and would later save countless others. As his house shook around him, his first instinct was to run outside to safety. Then he remembered something his grandfather had told him about an earthquake from decades earlier. Sometimes the debris from collapsing buildings poses more danger than staying inside. So Qin threw himself under his heavy wooden desk and held on while his world fell apart around him. When the shaking finally stopped, Qin emerged from his ruined house to find his neighbourhood transformed into something unrecognisable. Where his neighbour's two-storey home had stood, there was now only a pile of rubble. The well that had served his street for generations had disappeared entirely, swallowed by a crack in the earth that was wider than a man could jump. Bodies lay everywhere, some crushed by falling timbers, others apparently killed by the shaking itself, as if their hearts had simply stopped from terror. The scholar's account becomes most powerful when he describes the sounds that followed the earthquake. It was not the silence you might expect after such destruction, but a continuous chorus of human suffering. People trapped under collapsed buildings called for help that might never come. Children cried for parents who would never answer. The injured moaned in pain while the dying whispered final words that only the darkness heard. Qin wrote that these sounds haunted him for the rest of his life, visiting him in dreams decades after the earth had stopped shaking. What made this earthquake so uniquely devastating was the way people in the region lived. The lowest soil of Shaanxi province was perfect for carving yaodong, cave dwellings that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. Thousands of families had carved comfortable homes directly into hillsides, creating underground rooms that were connected by tunnels and passages. These caves had sheltered people for centuries, protecting them from warfare, bandits, and harsh weather. But when the earthquake struck, they became death traps on an unimaginable scale. An elderly woman named Li, whose story survives in local records, had lived in her family's yaodong for over 60 years. She had raised 8 children in those cave rooms, watching them grow up and have children of their own. On the night of the earthquake, 3 generations of her family were sleeping in different chambers of the cave complex. Li herself, her adult sons and their wives, and 13 grandchildren ranging in age from infant to teenager. When the earthquake began, Li's first thought was for the babies. She had experienced smaller earthquakes before and knew that the caves were generally safe, but this time was different. She could hear the lowest walls cracking, could feel chunks of earth raining down on her head. She tried to reach the chamber where her youngest grandchildren slept, but a tunnel collapsed before she could get there, sealing off that section of the cave forever. Li spent the next 3 days clawing at the collapsed earth with her bare hands, trying to dig through to where she knew her family lay buried. Other survivors found her there, her fingers bloody and raw, still calling out names in the desperate hope of hearing a response from beneath the tons of earth. When they finally convinced her to stop digging, she had become the sole survivor of a family that had numbered 21 people just 3 days earlier. The randomness of survival created its own form of trauma. In one village, an entire temple full of worshippers celebrating a lunar festival was buried when the roof collapsed, killing over 200 people instantly. But the temple's bell tower, which should have been the least stable structure, remained standing with its elderly bell ringer still alive inside, ringing frantically to call for help that would take days to arrive. A merchant named Wang had been travelling through the region when the earthquake struck. His first-person account, preserved in his family's archives, describes waking up in a roadside inn to find that the building had collapsed around him, but he was somehow uninjured, protected by a fallen beam that had created a small pocket of space around his sleeping mat. As he crawled out of the wreckage, he discovered that he was the only survivor among the inn's 32 guests and staff. Wang spent the following weeks walking through what had once been prosperous villages and market towns, now transformed into landscapes that looked like battlefields after some impossible war. He wrote of seeing entire families buried together in the ruins of their homes, their final positions suggesting they had been trying to protect each other when death came. In one collapsed house, he found parents who had clearly died shielding their children with their own bodies, though the children had not survived either. But Wang also witnessed extraordinary acts of human resilience and compassion. In the town of Huayin, he met a blacksmith who had been trapped for 4 days under his collapsed workshop. The man had survived by drinking water that seeped through the rubble and eating leather from his work apron. When rescuers finally reached him, his first words were not about his own condition, but questions about his neighbours and whether anyone was searching for other survivors. The earthquake created instant orphans on a scale that overwhelmed every social support system. Children who had awakened to find their parents dead, their homes destroyed, and their entire communities erased wandered the devastated landscape in groups, surviving by sharing whatever food they could scavenge from the ruins. Local officials, themselves dealing with massive losses, struggled to care for thousands of children who had nowhere to go and no one to claim them. One of these orphan children was a 10-year-old girl named May, whose story was recorded years later when she'd grown up and become a Buddhist nun. On the night of the earthquake, May had been sleeping next to her grandmother in their family's yaodong when the ceiling collapsed. A large stone pinned her grandmother's chest, and the old woman spent her final minutes comforting the terrified child, telling her stories and singing lullabies even as her own breathing became laboured and weak. May survived 3 days trapped beside her grandmother's body before rescue workers heard her crying and dug her out. She emerged from the collapsed cave to discover that not only were her parents and siblings dead, but her entire village had been wiped off the map. The places where she had played, the market where her mother had bought vegetables, the school where she had been learning to read, all of it was gone, replaced by a landscape of rubble and grief. The psychological impact of the earthquake proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Survivors like Chin Keda wrote about developing an intense fear of enclosed spaces that persisted for years afterward. Many people refused to sleep indoors, choosing to live in temporary shelters made of branches and cloth, rather than risk being trapped again under falling roofs. Some survivors reported that even minor tremors, the kind that would normally go unnoticed, sent them into panic attacks that left them unable to function for days. Chin's detailed observations about earthquake survival, born from his own terrifying experience, would eventually save thousands of lives in future disasters. His recommendation to shelter under sturdy furniture rather than run outside became standard advice that spread throughout China. His documentation of how different types of buildings responded to shaking influenced construction practices for generations. Most importantly, his unflinching account of what it felt like to live through such a disaster gave future generations a window into the human cost of natural catastrophes. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. A window. That is how 30 years of continental warfare began, with a single window in Prague Castle on May 23, 1618. Protestant nobles in Bohemia had gathered to protest the appointment of Catholic officials by the new Habsburg king, Ferdinand II. Their grievances were specific and limited: restore Protestant rights, respect local privileges, maintain religious balance. The meeting could have ended with compromise, negotiation, or peaceful resolution. Instead, in a moment of rage that would reshape European history, the nobles seized 2 imperial councillors and their secretary, dragged them to a 3rd-floor window, and hurled them out. The officials survived their 70-foot fall, landing in a pile of manure that cushioned their impact. But their humiliation became the spark that would ignite the most destructive conflict in European history. Ferdinand II, newly crowned Holy Roman Emperor, could not let such an insult pass unanswered. To do so would signal weakness to every Protestant prince, every rebellious noble, every subject who might question Habsburg authority. He mobilized his armies and marched on Prague, determined to crush the Bohemian revolt quickly and decisively. What should have been a brief campaign to restore order became something far more dangerous when the Bohemian estates responded by deposing Ferdinand entirely and offering their crown to Frederick V, the Protestant Elector Palatine. This escalation transformed a local dispute into an international crisis. Frederick V was not just any Protestant prince. He was married to Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of King James I of England. His territories in the Palatinate were strategically located along the Rhine, making them vital to both French and Spanish interests. His acceptance of the Bohemian crown created a direct challenge to Catholic power that drew in kingdoms and principalities across Europe. Spain pledged support to Ferdinand to protect Habsburg interests. France began financing Protestant armies to weaken Habsburg dominance. Denmark, Sweden, and the Dutch Republic saw opportunities to advance their own territorial ambitions. The Battle of White Mountain in 1620 should have ended the crisis. Ferdinand's Catholic League forces, supported by Spanish troops, decisively defeated the Bohemian army. Frederick V fled so quickly that he earned the mocking nickname the Winter King for his brief reign. But instead of bringing peace, Ferdinand's victory created new problems. His decision to strip Protestant nobles of their lands and redistribute them to Catholic supporters triggered massive refugee flows as thousands of Protestant families fled Bohemia and the Palatinate. These refugees became the seeds of further conflict. Protestant princes throughout the Holy Roman Empire watched Ferdinand's reconversion campaigns with growing alarm. When imperial armies moved into northern Germany to enforce Catholic conformity, local rulers realized that their own territories could be next. The war that had begun as a Bohemian revolt was transforming into a broader struggle for religious and political control of Central Europe. Christian IV of Denmark entered the war in 1625, ostensibly to protect German Protestantism, but actually to gain territory and influence in northern Germany. His intervention brought Swedish interests into play, as Gustav II Adolphus could not allow Danish control of the Baltic coast. The war that had started with 3 men thrown from a window now involved the major powers of northern and central Europe, each pursuing conflicting objectives that made peaceful resolution increasingly impossible. The entry of professional military entrepreneurs like Albrecht von Wallenstein changed the nature of the conflict entirely. Wallenstein offered to raise and maintain armies for Ferdinand II at no cost to the imperial treasury, financing his forces through systematic plunder of occupied territories. This innovation solved Ferdinand's immediate funding problems, but created a new disaster: armies that had to keep fighting and moving to survive economically, spreading destruction across vast regions of Central Europe. The mercenary system that emerged during the 1620s operated on a simple principle: armies had to feed themselves through the territories they occupied. This meant that even successful military campaigns became economic catastrophes for local populations. Soldiers who were not paid became bandits who robbed and murdered civilians. Armies that stayed too long in one area consumed all available food supplies, creating famines that killed far more people than actual battles. Gustav II Adolphus's intervention in 1630 marked the war's transformation into a true continental conflict. The Swedish king's advanced military tactics and well-disciplined armies initially brought stunning victories against imperial forces, but his success terrified other European powers, who realized that Swedish domination of Germany could upset the entire balance of power. Cardinal Richelieu of France began secretly funding Swedish operations, while simultaneously negotiating with Ferdinand II to prevent either Habsburg or Swedish hegemony. The death of Gustav II Adolphus at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632 created a power vacuum that made the conflict even more chaotic. Swedish forces, now led by less capable commanders, became increasingly dependent on plunder to maintain themselves. The disciplined armies that had initially protected Protestant territories transformed into marauding bands that terrorized Catholic and Protestant regions equally. Religious motivations that had originally justified the war gave way to pure survival instincts. France's open entry into the war in 1635 completed the conflict's evolution from religious war to great power struggle. Cardinal Richelieu explicitly abandoned any pretense of fighting for religious causes, allying Catholic France with Protestant Sweden and the Dutch Republic against Catholic Spain and Austria. The war that had begun as a dispute over religious rights became a naked contest for territorial and economic advantage. The military campaigns of the 1630s and 1640s created cascading humanitarian disasters across Central Europe. Armies numbering in the tens of thousands moved constantly, stripping bare every region they passed through. Agricultural production collapsed as farmers fled or were killed, their fields trampled by cavalry, and their livestock slaughtered to feed soldiers. Cities that had thrived for centuries found themselves besieged repeatedly, their populations decimated by violence, starvation, and disease. The plague outbreaks that accompanied military movements proved even more deadly than combat itself. Armies carrying typhus, dysentery, and bubonic plague spread these diseases to every community they encountered. The unsanitary conditions in military camps created ideal breeding grounds for epidemic disease, while the constant movement of troops ensured that infections spread rapidly across vast distances. Entire regions lost half their populations to disease during the 1630s and 1640s. Economic systems that had developed over centuries disintegrated under the pressure of constant warfare. Trade routes became too dangerous to use as armies controlled or destroyed major transportation networks. Currency systems collapsed as governments debased their coins to pay for military expenses. Credit networks that had financed international commerce disappeared when merchants and bankers fled or were ruined by military contributions and plunder. The social fabric of Central European society began to tear apart as traditional authority structures crumbled. Noble families that had ruled for generations found their castles burned and their lands occupied by foreign armies. Church hierarchies collapsed when bishops fled and monasteries were plundered. Urban guild systems broke down when master craftsmen died or fled, leaving no one to train apprentices or maintain quality standards. By the 1640s, the war had generated its own self-perpetuating momentum. Armies that had originally been tools of state policy became autonomous forces that continued fighting because they had no other means of survival. Officers who had started as servants of princes became warlords, controlling independent military enterprises. The political objectives that had originally motivated the conflict became secondary to the immediate need to keep massive military machines functioning. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the fighting but could not undo the transformation of Central Europe. The Holy Roman Empire that emerged from the war was a hollow shell, its emperor reduced to a figurehead while hundreds of semi-sovereign princes ruled their territories independently. The religious unity that had characterized medieval Europe was permanently shattered, replaced by a system where rulers determined their subjects' faiths. The economic prosperity that had made the war possible in the first place had been so thoroughly destroyed that recovery would take generations. The demographic catastrophe defied comprehension. Conservative estimates suggest that the German-speaking territories lost between 4 and 8 million people, roughly one-third of their pre-war population. Some regions, particularly in central Germany, lost over half their inhabitants. Entire cities were abandoned. Fertile agricultural areas reverted to wilderness. The cultural and intellectual achievements of the Renaissance were buried under mass graves and burned libraries. The Great Fire of London, 1666. Sunday, September 2nd, 1666, 1 a.m. In the narrow confines of Pudding Lane, baker Thomas Farriner checks his ovens one final time before retiring for the night. The embers should be dying down, cooling slowly as they have for years without incident. But tonight something is different. A spark, no larger than a pinhead, finds its way to a pile of firewood stacked too close to the oven. Within minutes, flames are licking at the wooden walls of the bakery. Farriner and his family escape through an upstairs window, but the fire remains behind, feeding on centuries of accumulated timber, pitch, and neglect. London has 4 days left. By 3 a.m., the fire has spread to neighbouring houses. The strong east wind that has been building all weekend fans the flames from building to building along Pudding Lane. Each wooden structure becomes fuel for the next, creating a chain reaction that moves faster than anyone can run. The city's night watchmen raise the alarm, ringing church bells and shouting through the narrow streets. But London's firefighting capabilities are medieval at best. Leather buckets, axes and hooks for pulling down burning thatch. Against what is coming, they might as well be carrying prayer books. Sir Thomas Bloodworth, the Lord Mayor of London, is awakened at his home with urgent news of the spreading fire. But Bloodworth, a man who has built his career on caution and deliberation makes the first in a series of fatal miscalculations. Looking out at what appears to be a typical house fire, he dismisses the emergency with words that will haunt London's memory. Piss on it. A woman might piss it out. He refuses to authorise emergency demolitions and returns to bed. By sunrise, over 300 houses will be in flames. 8 a.m. Sunday morning. Samuel Pepys, the naval administrator whose detailed diary will preserve this disaster for history, climbs to the top of the Tower of London and sees something that fills him with terror. The fire has reached the Thames and is spreading in both directions along the waterfront. Warehouses filled with oil, tar and timber explode in massive fireballs. The wind is strengthening, driving the flames westward into the heart of the city. Ships moored at the docks catch fire and drift downstream like floating torches, spreading the disaster to new areas. The first organised firefighting efforts begin at 10 a.m. when parish fire engines arrive at the scene. These primitive machines, essentially large syringes on wheels, can barely shoot water 30 feet. The crews work frantically, passing leather buckets in human chains from the Thames to feed their engines. But the fire is advancing faster than they can position their equipment. Each time they establish a position, the flames outflank them, forcing retreat after retreat. The fire is not just burning buildings now, it is creating its own weather system, generating winds that feed its advance. By noon, Bloodworth finally recognises the magnitude of the disaster and orders the first building demolitions. But his hesitation has cost precious hours. Teams with axes and hooks begin tearing down houses in the fire's path, trying to create fire breaks that will starve the flames of fuel. The work is back-breaking and dangerous, conducted in smoke so thick that men can barely see their tools. But they are racing against an enemy that moves faster than they can work. For every building they demolish, the fire consumes 10 more. Monday, September 3rd. The fire has been burning for 24 hours and shows no signs of slowing. It has crossed from Pudding Lane to Gracechurch Street, consuming the Royal Exchange and advancing toward the heart of London's commercial district. King Charles II arrives to personally oversee firefighting efforts, but even royal authority cannot overcome the physics of combustion and wind. The fire has developed its own momentum, creating updrafts that lift burning debris hundreds of feet into the air, starting new fires far ahead of the main blaze. Desperate measures begin at midday Monday. Military engineers suggest using gunpowder to blow up entire blocks of buildings, creating fire breaks too wide for the flames to cross. But using explosives in a city already on fire requires exquisite timing and enormous risk. The first attempts fail when demolition crews cannot get close enough to burning buildings to place their charges effectively. When they finally succeed in creating gaps, the wind simply carries burning embers across the breaks, starting fresh fires on the other side. Tuesday, September 4th. The fire reaches its peak intensity, consuming everything in its path with unstoppable fury. St. Paul's Cathedral, the massive Gothic structure that has dominated London's skyline for centuries, becomes an inferno when its wooden roof catches fire. The lead from the roof melts and runs in rivers down the streets, causing the very stones of the building to crack and crumble. The destruction of St. Paul's creates a psychological turning point. If this sacred fortress can fall, nothing in London is safe. The human cost mounts as panic spreads faster than the flames themselves. Tens of thousands of residents flee their homes, carrying whatever possessions they can manage, clogging the narrow streets and making firefighting nearly impossible. Carts and coaches become precious commodities as people pay desperate prices to move their belongings to safety. The Thames fills with boats overloaded with refugees and their goods, many capsizing under the weight of hastily packed household treasures. But even as London burns, the seeds of salvation are being planted. The Duke of York, the King's brother, takes personal command of firefighting operations and makes the crucial decision to use naval seamen as demolition crews. These men, accustomed to working under pressure and following orders without question, prove far more effective than civilian volunteers. They work systematically, creating coordinated fire breaks rather than random demolitions. Wednesday, September 5th. After 4 days of continuous burning, the wind finally begins to calm. The fire's advance slows for the first time, allowing demolition crews to get ahead of the flames. Using gunpowder more strategically, they create a series of wide fire breaks that the weakening fire cannot cross. Building by building, street by street, London's defenders finally begin to contain the disaster that has consumed their city. By Thursday morning, September the 6th, the last major flames are finally extinguished. London emerges from the smoke to survey damage that defies comprehension. Over 13,000 houses have been destroyed. Nearly 80% of the city within the old Roman walls. 87 churches lie in ruins. The Royal Exchange, Guildhall, and dozens of other public buildings are gone. Over 100,000 people, nearly 1/6 of London's population, have lost their homes. The medieval city that had grown organically over 1,000 years has been erased in less than a week. The 1693 Sicily earthquake. Death comes in many forms, but perhaps none more cruel than when it arrives while families are saying their morning prayers. On January 11th, 1693, in the ancient city of Catania, on Sicily's eastern coast, church bells had just finished calling the faithful to morning mass. The sun was rising over Mount Etna, and the Mediterranean sparkled in winter light that promised a peaceful Sunday. In homes throughout the city, children knelt beside their parents for morning devotions, their voices joining in familiar prayers that had been spoken in this place for over 1,000 years. Nobody knew they had less than 2 hours to live. Father Giuseppe Recupero was conducting early mass at the Cathedral of St. Agatha when the first tremor struck at 9:30 a.m. It was gentle at first, barely enough to rattle the silver chalices on the altar. The priest paused in his Latin prayers, looking up at the massive stone vaults above his congregation. Similar tremors had shaken Catania before. The city lived in the shadow of Etna, after all, and small earthquakes were part of life in eastern Sicily. Father Recupero resumed his service, his voice echoing through the cathedral where nearly 300 worshippers had gathered for Sunday morning mass. 50-year-old Salvatore Ortolano, a merchant who had spent his life travelling between Sicily's port cities, was kneeling in the front pew with his wife and 3 children. His youngest daughter, 8-year-old Maria, had been fidgeting during the service, and Salvatore had just whispered for her to be still when the cathedral began to shake more violently. The massive stone pillars that had supported the roof for centuries started to sway like trees in a windstorm. Salvatore had experienced earthquakes before, but nothing like this. He grabbed Maria and threw himself over her just as the roof came crashing down. What happened next was recorded by one of the few survivors, a young seminarian named Antonio Sanchez, who had been standing near the cathedral's main door. In his account, written weeks later from his hospital bed, Sanchez described how the entire building collapsed in less than 30 seconds. "The stones fell like rain," he wrote, "but a rain that brought death instead of life. The screams of the congregation were silenced almost instantly by the thunder of falling masonry. I saw Father Recupero disappear beneath the altar stones, his hands still raised in blessing." Sanchez survived because he was thrown clear of the building by the initial shock, landing in the street just as the cathedral's facade crumbled behind him. But his survival brought no relief, only a different kind of horror. The entire city of Catania was collapsing around him. Every church, every palace, every humble home was shaking itself apart. The narrow medieval streets filled with debris and bodies as buildings that had stood for centuries turned to rubble in minutes. In the residential quarter near the port, a young mother named Isabella Marino was preparing breakfast for her family when the earthquake struck. Her husband Pietro had left early for the fish market, and Isabella was alone with their twin 2-year-old sons, Carlo and Francesco. When the shaking began, her first instinct was to grab both children and run for the door. But the stone house, built by her grandfather's hands 50 years earlier, was collapsing too quickly. A wooden beam fell across the doorway, trapping them inside as the walls began to buckle. Isabella's account survives because she was found 3 days later, still alive beneath the wreckage, clutching the bodies of her sons. She had used her own body to shield them from falling stones, but the weight of the collapsed roof had crushed them both. Rescue workers found her singing lullabies to the dead children, her voice barely a whisper, her mind seemingly broken by grief and physical trauma. She would live for 6 more weeks in a makeshift hospital before dying from her injuries, but not before dictating her story to a priest who recorded her final testament. "I felt the earth move like the sea," Isabella told the priest. "The stones of our house cried out like living things as they broke apart. My babies looked at me with such trust, as if their mother could protect them from the world falling down. I tried, Blessed Virgin. I tried with my own flesh to keep the stones from touching them, but I was not strong enough, not strong enough. The earthquake lasted 4 terrible minutes, but its effects rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. 70 towns and cities across southeastern Sicily were damaged or destroyed completely. In Catania alone, over 16,000 people died out of a population of 20,000. Nearly 4 out of every 5 residents were killed instantly or died in the days that followed. The city that had been Sicily's second largest commercial centre simply ceased to exist. Marco Ventimiglia, a nobleman from Palermo who had been visiting relatives in Catania, found himself trapped for 2 days beneath the collapsed roof of the palazzo where he had been staying. His written account, preserved in the archives of his family estate, describes the psychological torture of hearing other survivors calling for help while being unable to respond or move. "I lay in darkness that was absolute," he wrote, listening to voices that grew weaker with each hour. A woman nearby called constantly for her daughter Lucia. A man recited the rosary until his voice gave out entirely. Children cried until they had no strength left to cry. When rescue workers finally reached Ventimiglia, he had lost hearing in one ear and could barely walk, but he insisted on helping search for other survivors. His account provides some of the most detailed descriptions of the rescue efforts. Workers dug by hand through collapsed buildings, following the sound of voices or the hope that air pockets might have preserved life beneath the rubble. They worked without rest, driven by the possibility that each pile of stones might hide a living person. "We found mostly death," Ventimiglia wrote, "but every life we saved justified the agony of those searches. I remember an old man pulled living from his collapsed shop after 4 days. He had survived by drinking his own urine and eating leather from his shoemaking supplies. When we brought him into the sunlight, he wept not from pain but from joy at seeing the sky again." The human stories from this disaster reveal not just the scope of physical destruction, but the complete breakdown of normal social structures. Traditional family hierarchies meant nothing when entire bloodlines were wiped out. A young street sweeper named Giuseppe Torresi became one of the city's leaders simply because he had survived and was strong enough to organise rescue efforts. Noble families that had ruled for generations found themselves reduced to begging for food alongside their former servants. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the children who survived alone. 7-year-old Caterina Basile was found after 5 days, sitting beside her dead mother and singing the songs her mother had taught her. She had tried to wake her mother by offering her water and bread, not understanding that death had taken her beyond such earthly needs. When rescuers carried Caterina away, she insisted on bringing her mother's rosary, the only possession that connected her to her lost family. The earthquake created its own form of cruel mathematics. In the town of Noto, which was completely destroyed, only 900 people survived out of a population of 16,000. These survivors faced impossible choices about burial, about property, about how to continue living when everything they had known was gone. Some chose to leave Sicily entirely, travelling to mainland Italy or even America to start completely new lives. Others stayed and began the slow work of rebuilding, often on the bones of their buried loved ones. Dr. Antonino Pellegrino, one of only 3 physicians who survived in Catania, kept detailed medical records of the disaster's aftermath. His notes, preserved in the Vatican archives, describe treating everything from crushing injuries to what we would now recognise as severe psychological trauma. "The survivors suffer not just in body but in spirit," he wrote. "They start at every small sound, believing another earthquake has come. They refuse to enter any building with stone walls. Some have stopped speaking entirely, as if words themselves died with their families." The rebuilding that eventually emerged from this catastrophe created the Baroque architectural masterpieces that tourists admire in Sicily today. But for the people who lived through January 11th, 1693, beauty was meaningless compared to loss. They had learned that the earth itself could not be trusted, that morning prayers offered no protection against sudden death, that love could not shield children from falling stones, the Great Lisbon Earthquake, 1755. November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day. At 9:40 in the morning, as church bells across Lisbon called the faithful to Mass, something happened that defied every explanation available to 18th century minds. The earth shook with such violence that the greatest city in Portugal, home to over 200,000 people, seat of a global empire, centre of Enlightenment learning, collapsed into rubble in less than 6 minutes. But this was not just another earthquake. What followed was a sequence of disasters so unprecedented that witnesses struggled to find words to describe them. A massive tsunami swept away the survivors who had fled to the harbour. Fires raged for days through the ruins. And across Europe, the greatest philosophers of the age found themselves confronting a question that would reshape Western thought. If God is good and all-powerful, why do the innocent suffer? In the immediate aftermath, survivors and contemporary observers could only grasp at traditional explanations. The Catholic Church proclaimed the disaster as divine punishment for Portugal's sins, pointing to the date All Saints' Day as evidence of God's wrath against a city grown too worldly and corrupt. Popular pamphlets blamed everything from secret Jewish conspiracies to the influence of Protestant heretics. Some claimed the earthquake was caused by underground winds trapped in vast caverns beneath the earth. Others suggested that electrical discharges in the atmosphere had somehow shaken the ground. The most learned minds of Europe struggled to make sense of what had happened. Voltaire, the great champion of reason and progress, found his philosophical optimism shattered by news from Lisbon. How could this be the best of all possible worlds, when innocent children were crushed in collapsing churches while saying their prayers? His poem on the Lisbon disaster challenged the comfortable certainties of Enlightenment thought. What crime, what sin had those young hearts conceived that lie, bleeding and torn on mother's breast? Jean-Jacques Rousseau, responding to Voltaire's despair, offered a different interpretation. The earthquake itself was natural, he argued, but the disaster was magnified by human choices. If people had not crowded into a large city, if they had not built tall buildings and narrow streets, if they had heeded warning signs and lived more simply, the death toll would have been minimal. The catastrophe revealed not divine malevolence, but human folly in defying natural order. For decades, these philosophical debates raged across Europe while the scientific mystery remained unsolved. Scholars knew that earthquakes occurred in patterns. They were common in Italy, frequent in parts of Greece, familiar in regions near active volcanoes, but Lisbon was not near any obvious source of seismic activity. The city sat on what appeared to be stable ground, far from known volcanic regions. The earthquake seemed to come from nowhere, to follow no comprehensible rules. The breakthrough in understanding began not with scientific instruments, those would not be invented for another century, but with systematic investigation ordered by Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the Marquis of Pombal, Portugal's chief minister. Within months of the disaster, Pombal launched what historians now recognise as the first modern seismological survey. He sent detailed questionnaires to every parish priest and government official throughout Portugal and its colonies, asking specific questions. When exactly did the shaking begin? How long did it last? Which direction did the waves seem to come from? What happened to wells and springs? How high did the tsunami waters rise? This systematic data collection revealed patterns that no single observer could have detected. The earthquake's effects were not random but followed clear geographic distributions. Damage was most severe along the coast and decreased inland. The tsunami was highest in certain bays and harbours, while barely affecting others. Springs dried up or changed their flow in predictable patterns. For the first time, scientists could map an earthquake's effects across a large region and begin to deduce its source. The investigation revealed that the earthquake had originated somewhere beneath the Atlantic Ocean, probably 200 kilometres southwest of Lisbon. The initial shock waves had travelled through solid rock, reaching the city in seconds. But the earthquake had also displaced enormous volumes of seawater, creating the tsunami that arrived at Lisbon's harbour 20 minutes later. Observers in Morocco reported that the sea first retreated, exposing the harbour floor, then returned as a wall of water that swept several kilometres inland. Modern seismology has solved the mystery that puzzled 18th century investigators. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake originated along the complex boundary where the African and Eurasian tectonic plates meet beneath the Atlantic Ocean. This region, now known as the Azores-Gibraltar Transform Fault, is characterised by a series of thrust faults where the African plate is being pushed beneath the European plate. The earthquake probably occurred along the Marques de Pombal fault, named after the very minister who first scientifically investigated the disaster. Computer models using modern understanding of plate tectonics can now recreate the 1755 event in precise detail. The earthquake registered approximately magnitude 8.5-9.0, making it one of the most powerful ever recorded in the Atlantic. The rupture zone extended over 200 kilometers of seafloor, displacing billions of tons of water and generating tsunami waves that radiated outward at speeds of over 700 kilometers per hour. These waves crossed the Atlantic in hours, causing damage as far away as Ireland and Cornwall. The tsunami itself followed laws of physics that were completely unknown in 1755. When the earthquake displaced the ocean floor, it created waves that behaved differently from normal wind-driven waves. Tsunami waves have enormous wavelengths, sometimes hundreds of kilometers from crest to crest, and can travel across entire ocean basins with minimal energy loss. As these waves approached the shallow waters near coastlines, they slowed down but increased dramatically in height, sometimes reaching over 20 meters when they struck the Portuguese coast. The fires that consumed Lisbon after the earthquake followed predictable patterns that contemporary observers could not understand. The shaking had toppled thousands of candles and overturned cooking fires throughout the city. Broken gas lines from whale oil street lamps added fuel to the blazes. Most crucially, the earthquake had broken the city's water supply system, leaving firefighters helpless as flames spread through the debris-filled streets. Modern fire science explains why Lisbon burned for 6 days. The combination of wooden construction, combustible materials, broken water mains, and strong winds created a perfect firestorm. What makes the 1755 earthquake particularly significant in the history of science is how it forced European thinkers to abandon supernatural explanations and embrace systematic investigation. Pomball's questionnaire survey established the template for modern disaster research. His systematic collection of eyewitness accounts, his mapping of damage patterns, and his analysis of the relationship between geology and destruction became the foundation for the science of seismology. The earthquake also demonstrated the interconnectedness of natural systems in ways that 18th century science was just beginning to appreciate. The same geological forces that created the earthquake also influenced Portugal's landscape, its mineral resources, and its vulnerability to future disasters. The tsunami revealed how events on the ocean floor could affect coastlines thousands of kilometers away. The fires showed how human settlement patterns could amplify natural disasters. Modern Portugal's earthquake preparedness reflects lessons learned from the 1755 disaster. Building codes require construction techniques that can withstand severe shaking. Tsunami warning systems monitor seismic activity throughout the Atlantic. Emergency response plans account for the likelihood that earthquakes will disrupt water supplies and communication systems. The scientific investigation that Pombal launched in the aftermath of tragedy continues today in the form of continuous seismic monitoring and computer modelling of earthquake scenarios. The philosophical impact of the Lisbon earthquake extended far beyond Portugal's borders. The disaster marked a turning point in European thought, forcing intellectuals to abandon simple explanations of natural disasters as divine punishment and embrace more complex understandings of natural processes. The systematic investigation of the earthquake's causes helped establish the principle that natural phenomena could be understood through careful observation and analysis, rather than appeals to supernatural intervention. The Irish potato famine, 1845 to 1852. In the summer of 1845, Ireland pulsed with life. 8 million people called this island home, making it one of the most densely populated places in Europe. The fields stretched green and endless, row upon row of potato plants swaying in the Atlantic breeze. Children ran barefoot between the ridges while their fathers worked the small plots that kept families alive. Markets buzzed with activity as farmers brought their harvest to town, their carts heavy with the tubers that had become the foundation of Irish survival. This was not the Ireland of today. This was a land where hope grew in the soil alongside the potatoes. Despite British rule and the harsh realities of tenant farming, the Irish had found their way to prosperity of sorts. The population had exploded from just 2 million in 1700 to 8 million by 1845. Young couples married earlier and had larger families because the potato made it possible. A single acre could feed a family of 6 for an entire year. The vegetable was nutritious, filling, and grew well in Ireland's damp climate. It seemed like a miracle crop. The Irish had become the most potato-dependent people on earth. While the English ate bread and meat, the Irish ate potatoes. 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. A working man consumed between 10 and 14 pounds of potatoes daily. Children learned to peel them before they could write their names. The smell of boiling potatoes filled every cottage from dawn to dusk. But this abundance carried hidden dangers. The Irish had put all their eggs in one basket, or rather, all their lives in one plant. Most families grew just one variety called the Irish lumper. It was hardy and productive, but it was also genetically uniform. Every plant across the island was essentially a clone of every other plant. If disease struck one, it could strike them all. The first whispers of trouble came in September 1845. Farmers in County Waterford noticed something strange. Their potato plants, which had looked healthy just days before, were turning black. The leaves curled and rotted. The stems became soft and slimy. When they dug up the tubers, many were already turning to mush in the ground. The smell was unforgettable, a sweet, sickening rot that made people gag. Word spread quickly through the countryside. Other farmers reported similar problems. The Dublin newspapers began carrying reports of potato disease, but many dismissed it as a local issue. Ireland had seen crop failures before. Potatoes occasionally rotted in wet years. This would pass, but it didn't pass. By October, the disease had spread across most of southern Ireland. Families who had counted on their winter stores found their potato pits filled with black, stinking slime. The fungus called Phytophthora infestans had arrived in Ireland, though no one knew its name or understood how it worked. They only knew that their food was disappearing. The disease moved with terrifying speed. Healthy plants could be destroyed in a matter of days. Farmers watched helplessly as entire fields turned black almost overnight. The fungus spread through the air on tiny spores carried by wind and rain. Ireland's cool, wet autumn of 1845 created perfect conditions for the blight to thrive and multiply. By December 1845, roughly half of Ireland's potato crop had been destroyed. Families began rationing their remaining stores. They mixed potatoes with other foods to make them last longer. Some ate grass and seaweed to fill their stomachs. The lucky ones had a few chickens or a pig they could sell for grain. But for most Irish families, there was no backup plan. They had never needed one before. The government in London responded slowly. British officials couldn't quite grasp the severity of the situation. How could an entire nation depend so heavily on one crop? Prime Minister Robert Peel authorised the secret purchase of corn from America, but the response was too little, too late. The corn arrived as strange yellow kernels that the Irish didn't know how to prepare properly. Without proper grinding and cooking, it caused digestive problems and provided little nutrition. Spring 1846 brought new hope. Farmers planted their potato crops again, believing the disease had passed. The plants emerged green and healthy, but by July the familiar signs returned. This time the blight struck with even greater fury. Nearly the entire crop failed across Ireland. Fields that had promised food for millions became graveyards of rotting plants. The catastrophe escalated beyond anything Ireland had ever experienced. By winter 1846, people were dying of starvation in significant numbers. Families ate their seed potatoes, ensuring there would be no crop the following year. They sold their tools, their furniture, anything of value to buy food. Landlords began evicting tenants who couldn't pay rent. Entire villages were abandoned as people fled in search of food or work. The British government's response revealed a callous indifference that would haunt Anglo-Irish relations for generations. Charles Trevelyan, the civil servant in charge of relief efforts, believed that the famine was God's judgment on the Irish for their supposed laziness and moral failings. He worried that too much aid would make the Irish dependent on charity. Even as reports of mass starvation flooded in, he cut relief programs and insisted that Ireland should feed itself. Public works projects were established, but they paid starvation wages for back-breaking labour. Men too weak from hunger to work properly were fired from these jobs and left to starve. Soup kitchens opened, but they served watery gruel that barely kept people alive. Meanwhile, Ireland continued to export grain and livestock to England. Ships laden with food sailed past starving Irish villages, protected by British soldiers. By 1847, known as Black and 47, the dying had reached enormous proportions. Entire families perished in their cottages. Bodies lay unburied because there was no one left with strength to dig graves. Diseases like typhus and cholera spread rapidly among the weakened population. Workhouses built to house the poor became overcrowded death traps. The sound of keening, the traditional Irish funeral cry, echoed across the countryside day and night. Those who could flee began leaving Ireland in unprecedented numbers. The Great Exodus had begun. Families sold everything they owned to buy passage to America, Canada, or Australia. They crowded onto ships that quickly became known as coffin ships. These vessels were overcrowded, unsanitary, and poorly provisioned. Many passengers died during the crossing from disease or starvation. Others arrived in North America so sick they died within days of landing. The famine's grip tightened year after year. The potato crops failed again in 1848 and remained unreliable through 1852. Each year brought new waves of death and emigration. Villages that had thrived for centuries became ghost towns. The Irish language began disappearing from entire regions as its speakers died or emigrated. Ancient customs and traditions vanished with the people who had preserved them. Children suffered the most. Those who survived often bore the physical and mental scars of malnutrition for life. Families were torn apart as parents sent children to workhouses or relatives abroad. Many children became orphans and were shipped to other countries where they worked as labourers or servants. The lucky ones maintained contact with their families. Most never saw Ireland again. The famine finally ended in 1852, but Ireland was forever changed. More than 1 million people had died from starvation and related diseases. Another 2 million had emigrated, many never to return. The population had fallen by almost 25% in just 7 years. Entire counties looked like battlefields, dotted with abandoned villages and roofless cottages. The survivors faced a transformed society. The system of tiny potato plots gave way to larger farms growing varied crops. The Irish language retreated to the western edges of the island. Traditional music and storytelling declined as the people who carried these traditions lay in unmarked graves or lived in exile across the ocean. The Catholic Church gained enormous influence as people sought comfort in faith during their darkest hours. But perhaps the most lasting change was psychological. The Great Hunger shattered the Irish people's trust in both their British rulers and their own land. For generations afterward, Irish mothers would tell their children never to depend entirely on any one thing for survival. The fear of famine became embedded in the national consciousness. Even today, Ireland maintains strategic food reserves and agricultural policies shaped by the memory of those terrible years. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864. On a sweltering summer day in 1837, a young man named Hong Xiu-Quan walked out of the examination hall in Guangzhou for the third time in his life. His hands shook as he read the results posted on the wall. Failed. Again. The Imperial Civil Service examination, the golden pathway to respect and prosperity in Chinese society, had rejected him once more. Hong was 23 years old, intelligent and desperate to escape his family's poverty. But the ancient system had no place for him. This single moment of personal failure would set in motion the deadliest civil war in human history. Hong returned to his village defeated and humiliated. In Chinese society, passing the imperial examinations meant everything. It was how poor men became government officials, how families climbed from a peasant status to the educated class. Without that precious degree, Hong faced a life of teaching village children for meagre wages, while watching less capable men rise above him simply because they had memorized the right classical texts. The rejection broke something inside Hong. He fell into a deep fever that lasted weeks. During his delirium, he experienced vivid hallucinations. He saw an old man with a golden beard who called himself his heavenly father. A middle-aged man appeared, claiming to be his elder brother, telling Hong that demons had invaded the earth and needed to be destroyed. When Hong finally recovered, he dismissed these visions as fever dreams, but the failure haunted him. Hong attempted the examination again in 1843 and failed for the fourth and final time. Chinese law allowed only 4 attempts. His dreams of advancement were permanently dead. In his despair, Hong remembered some Christian pamphlets he had received years earlier from an American missionary. He had ignored them at the time, but now he read them carefully. The words hit him like lightning. The pamphlets spoke of God the Father and Jesus Christ the Son. Suddenly, Hong's fever visions made perfect sense. The old man with the golden beard was God. The middle-aged man was Jesus. And if Jesus was his elder brother, that made Hong the younger brother of Christ himself. God had chosen him for a divine mission to save China from the demons that corrupted it. This revelation transformed Hong's personal failure into cosmic purpose. The Qing dynasty ruling China were not Chinese, but Manchus from the north. In Hong's mind, they were the demons his heavenly father wanted him to destroy. The corrupt officials who had failed him in the examinations were servants of these demons. Hong began preaching his new gospel, combining Christian ideas with Chinese rebellion. He gathered followers who called themselves the Taiping, meaning Great Peace. The movement started small, but grew rapidly. Hong's message appealed to millions of Chinese who felt crushed by poverty, corruption, and foreign domination. The Opium Wars had weakened China and forced humiliating treaties on the Qing government. Natural disasters had brought floods and famines. Secret societies and bandits roamed the countryside. Hong offered hope and purpose to people who had neither. By 1850, Hong had thousands of armed followers. The trigger that turned religious movement into full rebellion came when Qing troops tried to arrest Hong and disperse his followers. Instead of surrendering, the Taiping fought back and won. Word spread quickly through southern China that the god worshippers had defeated imperial soldiers. Recruits flocked to join what they saw as a winning cause. The military success created the first link in a deadly chain reaction. Victory brought more followers, which required more territory to support them, which meant more battles with Qing forces. Each Taiping victory weakened the dynasty's authority and encouraged other rebel groups across China. The Nian rebels in the north, Muslim revolts in the west, and various secret societies all saw opportunity in the chaos. China began fragmenting as multiple rebellions erupted simultaneously. The Taiping army grew from thousands to hundreds of thousands. They captured key cities along the Yangtze River, China's main transportation route. In 1853, they seized Nanjing, the former imperial capital, and declared it the capital of their heavenly kingdom. Hong proclaimed himself the heavenly king, ruler of a new Chinese dynasty that would replace the corrupt Qing. But military success created new problems that Hong and his followers had never anticipated. Governing territory proved far more difficult than conquering it. The Taiping tried to implement radical social reforms based on Hong's religious visions. They banned private property, alcohol, tobacco, and opium. They declared equality between men and women. They segregated the sexes completely, forbidding even married couples from living together. These extreme policies alienated many Chinese who might otherwise have supported rebellion against the Qing. The social upheaval triggered massive population movements. Millions of people fled areas controlled by either the Taiping or government forces. Traditional trade routes collapsed. Agriculture was disrupted as peasants abandoned their fields to join armies or escape fighting. The economic disruption created famines that killed far more people than the actual battles. The Qing dynasty, meanwhile, faced an existential crisis. The imperial army, designed to maintain internal order, proved incapable of defeating the Taiping. The dynasty was forced to rely on regional warlords and their private armies. This decision fundamentally changed Chinese politics. Local strongmen gained power and independence that they would never give back to the central government. The chain reaction had permanently weakened imperial authority. Desperate for help, the Qing turned to foreign powers. European merchants and governments watched the rebellion with growing alarm. The Taiping banned opium and threatened to disrupt the profitable trade arrangements forced on China after the Opium Wars. Western powers began providing weapons and military advisors to the Qing. An Englishman named Charles Gordon led the ever-victorious army, a force of Chinese soldiers trained and equipped by Europeans. Foreign intervention tipped the balance against the Taiping, but it came at enormous cost to Chinese sovereignty. The dynasty survived by becoming even more dependent on Western support. The unequal treaties imposed after the Opium Wars were extended and expanded. Foreign troops remained stationed in Chinese cities. The chain reaction had transformed China from a proud empire into a semi-colonial state. The fighting intensified as both sides became more desperate. The Taiping, seeing their dream of heavenly kingdom slipping away, became increasingly fanatical. Government forces backed by foreign weapons pressed their advantage ruthlessly. Cities changed hands multiple times, each conquest followed by massacres of soldiers and civilians alike. The lower Yangtze region, once China's most prosperous area, became a wasteland of burned villages and mass graves. Internal conflicts further weakened the Taiping cause. Hong's mental state deteriorated as military defeats mounted. He became increasingly paranoid and erratic, executing loyal generals he suspected of treason. Other Taiping leaders fought among themselves for power and resources. The religious unity that had originally bound the movement together dissolved into factional warfare. By 1864, the Qing forces had surrounded Nanjing. Hong died mysteriously in June, either from illness or poison. With their heavenly king dead and their capital under siege, the remaining Taiping defenders faced impossible odds. When Nanjing finally fell in July 1864, government troops slaughtered the remaining rebels and many civilians who had supported them. The rebellion was over, but its consequences echoed for generations. The death toll was staggering. Modern historians estimate that between 20 and 30 million people died during the 14 years of fighting. Entire regions were depopulated. The Yangtze Valley lost more than half its inhabitants. Some areas took decades to recover their pre-rebellion population levels. The chain reaction had reshaped China permanently. The Qing dynasty survived, but never recovered its former strength. Regional warlords continued to challenge central authority. Foreign influence expanded as European powers exploited Chinese weakness. The traditional examination system, which had triggered Hong's original rebellion, lost much of its prestige as military leaders gained power over civilian scholars. Maybe most importantly, the rebellion planted ideas that would eventually destroy imperial rule entirely. Hong's vision of overthrowing a corrupt dynasty and creating a new social order inspired later revolutionaries. Sun Yat-sen, who would lead the revolution that ended imperial rule in 1911, explicitly cited the Taiping as predecessors. Mao Zedong praised Hong as a peasant revolutionary hero who anticipated communist ideals. The Great Chicago Fire, 1871. The clock on the courthouse tower read 9 p.m. on Sunday, October 8, 1871. Daniel Sullivan was walking home through the dusty streets of Chicago's South Side when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Orange light flickered through the windows of Patrick O'Leary's barn on DeKoven Street. Flames were already dancing along the hay-filled interior, and there was no one around to stop them. Sullivan had no way of knowing that he was witnessing the opening moments of the most devastating urban fire in American history. The next 3 days would unfold like a nightmare in slow motion, each hour bringing new horrors as the flames consumed everything in their path. What started as a small barn fire would become an unstoppable monster that devoured the heart of America's fastest-growing city. The countdown to disaster had actually begun months earlier. Chicago had endured one of the driest summers on record in 1871. From July through September, less than 3 inches of rain had fallen on the city. The wooden sidewalks, buildings, and even the streets themselves were bone dry. The Chicago River ran so low that boats could barely navigate its channels. Wells dried up across the city. Every surface seemed to beg for a spark. Weather experts warned that conditions were dangerous. Newspapers ran articles about the fire risk. City officials discussed the problem in meetings, but Chicago was booming too rapidly to slow down for safety concerns. New buildings went up every day, most of them wooden structures built quickly and cheaply to house the thousands of immigrants flooding into the city each month. The lumber came from Wisconsin forests, creating a supply chain of dry timber that stretched for hundreds of miles. By early October, smaller fires had been breaking out across the region with alarming frequency. On October 7th, just 1 day before the Great Fire began, a massive blaze had consumed 4 city blocks on the west side. The Chicago Fire Department spent nearly 20 hours fighting that fire, using up enormous amounts of water and leaving the firefighters exhausted. Half of the city's 185 firefighters were still recovering from that battle when the alarm bells began ringing again on Sunday night. Fire Marshal Robert Williams received the first report at 9:30 p.m. The initial dispatch was garbled and sent firefighters to the wrong location, several blocks away from the actual fire. This crucial mistake cost precious minutes while the flames spread through the O'Leary barn and began reaching toward neighbouring structures. By the time the fire companies arrived at the correct address, the blaze had already jumped to 3 more buildings. Williams surveyed the scene and immediately realised they were facing something far worse than a typical structure fire. The wind was picking up from the southwest, pushing the flames directly toward the heart of the city. The drought had turned every building into kindling. Worse still, many of his best firefighters were too tired from the previous day's battle to perform at full strength. Some fire companies were operating with only half their normal crews. The fire department made their first attempt to contain the blaze by creating a fire break along the Chicago River. They positioned their steam engines along the waterfront and began pumping river water onto the advancing flames. For a brief moment, it seemed like the strategy might work. The fire appeared to slow as it approached the river. Williams sent word to Mayor Roswell Mason that they had the situation under control. But the wind had other plans. Around midnight, strong gusts began carrying burning debris across the river. Witnesses watched in horror as flaming pieces of wood sailed through the air like deadly snow. These firebrands landed on rooftops throughout the downtown area, instantly creating dozens of new fires scattered across the business district. The single fire had become a swarm of fires, far beyond the capacity of any fire department to handle. Williams frantically telegraphed neighboring cities for help. Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and other nearby cities began loading their fire engines onto trains bound for Chicago. But the closest help was hours away, and the fires were doubling in size every few minutes. The Chicago firefighters found themselves fighting a losing battle against an enemy that seemed to multiply faster than they could respond. The second major attempt to stop the fire came around 2 a.m. Monday morning. City officials decided to create a fire break by demolishing buildings in the fire's path. They used gunpowder to blow up structures, hoping to create a gap too wide for the flames to cross. Teams of workers rushed through the downtown area, evacuating buildings and preparing them for destruction. The plan backfired catastrophically. The explosions scattered burning debris even further, starting new fires in areas that had been safe moments before. The gunpowder created its own hazards as sparks ignited unexpected caches of explosives stored in businesses throughout the district. Instead of stopping the fire, the demolition efforts accelerated its spread and added chaos to an already desperate situation. By dawn on Monday, October 9th, the fire had consumed most of Chicago's central business district. The flames had jumped the main branch of the Chicago River and were racing toward the north side, home to some of the city's wealthiest residents. The wind continued to strengthen, turning the fire into a tornado of flame that created its own weather patterns. Witnesses described seeing burning pieces of roof lifted hundreds of feet into the air before landing miles away. Mayor Mason declared martial law and sent urgent telegrams to Springfield requesting military assistance. The city's water pumping station came under threat as the flames approached the waterworks. If the pumps failed, the fire department would lose all water pressure, making their steam engines useless. Engineers and firefighters worked desperately to protect the facility, but the heat was becoming unbearable. The third and final attempt to control the fire focused on saving the north side. Firefighters positioned themselves along North Avenue, the widest street between the flames and the residential neighborhoods beyond. They soaked buildings with water and stationed men with buckets every few yards. For several hours, this last line of defense held. Residents began to believe they might escape the inferno that had already claimed so much of their city. But the fire had grown too powerful to be stopped by conventional methods. Around noon on Monday, the wind shifted and intensified. Flaming debris began raining down behind the firefighters' lines. The north side residents watched in growing panic as fires erupted in their backyards and on their rooftops. The last organized defense collapsed as firefighters abandoned their positions to save their own lives. The waterworks finally succumbed to the flames Monday afternoon. The massive pumping station, built to supply clean water to the entire city, became a towering inferno that could be seen for miles. When the pumps failed, water pressure dropped to nothing throughout Chicago. Fire engines became useless equipment as their crews stood helplessly watching the city burn around them. Monday night brought the fire's climax. The flames reached the shores of Lake Michigan, having consumed virtually everything in their path. The downtown business district was gone. Thousands of homes lay in ashes. Major landmarks like the post office, the courthouse, and countless churches had vanished. An estimated 300,000 people, nearly one-third of Chicago's population, were homeless and wandering the lakefront with whatever possessions they had managed to carry. The fire finally began to weaken early Tuesday morning as the wind died down and the flames ran out of fuel. Rain started falling around midnight Tuesday. the first significant precipitation Chicago had seen in months. By Wednesday morning, October 11th, the Great Fire was officially extinguished, though smaller blazes continued smouldering for days afterward. The devastation defied comprehension. More than 17,000 buildings had been destroyed across 2,100 acres. At least 300 people were confirmed dead, though the actual number was likely much higher. Property damage was estimated at $200 million, an astronomical sum that bankrupted dozens of insurance companies. The fire had burned with such intensity that it had melted metal and turned stone into powder. In the aftermath, investigators and survivors asked the inevitable question: could this disaster have been prevented? The answer haunted Chicago for generations. Better building codes could have slowed the fire's spread. More water reserves might have kept the pumps running longer. Improved communication systems could have prevented the initial misdirection of firefighters. A quicker response to the drought conditions might have reduced the fire danger. Most painfully, simple luck could have changed everything. If the wind had blown from a different direction, the fire might have burned harmlessly toward the lake instead of into the city centre. If the previous day's fire had not exhausted the firefighters, they might have controlled the O'Leary barn fire before it spread. If the telegraph operator had sent the first alarm to the correct location, those crucial early minutes might have made all the difference. Krakatoa eruption, 1883. At precisely 10:02 a.m. on August 27, 1883, people in Perth, Australia, nearly 2,000 miles away, heard what sounded like distant cannon fire. The same mysterious booming reached the island of Rodrigues near Mauritius, over 3,000 miles in the opposite direction. Telegraph operators from Europe to Asia began reporting strange disturbances in their instruments. Barometers around the globe showed sudden, inexplicable spikes in air pressure. Ships' captains logged bizarre atmospheric phenomena in their logbooks. Something extraordinary had happened, but no one knew what or where. The source of this worldwide mystery lay in the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra, where the volcanic island of Krakatoa had just produced the loudest sound in recorded human history. But in 1883, the world lacked the scientific framework to understand what they had witnessed. The explosion defied everything people thought they knew about volcanoes, sound, and the natural world itself. For days after August 27th, newspapers across the globe published confused and contradictory reports. Some claimed a great naval battle had taken place in the Dutch East Indies. Others suggested massive mining explosions or earthquakes. The Dutch colonial authorities in Batavia, just 90 miles from Krakatoa, initially had no more information than observers thousands of miles away. Telegraph cables to the area had been severed, and the few ships that ventured near the strait returned with tales so fantastic that many dismissed them as sailors' stories. The first reliable reports emerged a week later when the steamship Gouverneur General Loudon managed to approach the area where Krakatoa had stood. Captain Lindeman's description shocked the world. The island was gone. Where a 600-foot-tall volcano had risen from the sea, only a few scattered rocks remained above water. The entire northern two-thirds of the island had vanished, leaving behind a gaping underwater crater more than 800 feet deep. But even these eyewitness accounts raised more questions than they answered. How could an entire island simply disappear? What force could be so powerful that its sound travelled a quarter of the way around the Earth? And most puzzling of all, why were people in Australia and Africa reporting strange sounds and atmospheric disturbances hours before the main explosion occurred? The mystery deepened as scientists began gathering data from around the world. Barograph recordings showed that air pressure waves from the explosion had circled the Earth not once, but 4 complete times over the following week. The waves travelled at nearly 700 miles per hour, taking about 36 hours to complete each circuit. No one had ever documented anything like this before. The very idea that a single event could create atmospheric disturbances detectable on the opposite side of the planet challenged basic assumptions about how the Earth's atmosphere worked. British scientists, led by the Royal Society of London, launched the most comprehensive investigation of a natural disaster that had ever been attempted. They collected barometer readings from more than 50 weather stations worldwide, creating the first global map of atmospheric pressure waves. They gathered testimonies from ship captains, colonial officials, and missionaries throughout the region. They analysed samples of volcanic dust that had fallen as far away as Europe and studied the strange optical effects that turned sunsets blood red for months after the eruption. The detective work revealed a disaster of almost incomprehensible scale. The explosion had not been a single event, but a series of increasingly violent eruptions over several days. The final cataclysmic blast on August 27th released energy equivalent to 200 megatons of TNT, more than 10,000 times the power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The sound reached an estimated 180 decibels at a distance of 100 miles, making it the loudest sound ever recorded by human beings. Contemporary explanations for the disaster reflected the limited scientific understanding of the time. Many attributed the explosion to the mixing of seawater with underground fires, an idea dating back to ancient Greek theories about volcanoes. Others suggested that vast underground caverns had collapsed, creating a vacuum that sucked in the sea. Religious leaders proclaimed it divine judgment, while popular magazines speculated about everything from underground gas explosions to collisions with meteors. The reality, as modern volcanology would later reveal, was both simpler and more terrifying. Krakatoa sat at the intersection of three tectonic plates, where the Indo-Australian plate slides beneath the Eurasian plate. This subduction zone had created a magma chamber filled with highly pressurized molten rock, saturated with dissolved gases. When seawater breached the chamber during the eruption sequence, it instantly vaporized, creating a steam explosion of unimaginable violence. The missing piece of the puzzle was the tsunami that followed the explosion. While scientists of the 1880s focused on the atmospheric effects, the deadliest consequence of Krakatoa's destruction was the massive wave that radiated outward from the collapsing island. The sudden removal of billions of tons of rock created a displacement wave that reached heights of 130 feet as it struck the coasts of Java and Sumatra. The tsunami arrived without warning at coastal towns that had been bustling with life just minutes before. Anya, a thriving port town, was completely obliterated by waves over 100 feet high. The town of Merrick disappeared beneath a 150-foot wall of water. Along both coastlines, the waves penetrated several miles inland, destroying everything in their path. More than 36,000 people died in the tsunami, though many victims were never found or counted. Contemporary accounts struggled to describe the incomprehensible destruction. Survivors spoke of the sea retreating far beyond the normal low tide mark, exposing the ocean floor for miles. Fish flopped helplessly in the suddenly dry harbours, while people stood transfixed by the unprecedented sight. Then the water returned as a black wall that seemed to touch the sky, carrying with it ships, buildings, trees, and thousands of human beings. The scientific investigation of Krakatoa marked a turning point in understanding natural disasters. For the first time, researchers had global data about a single event, allowing them to trace cause and effect across vast distances. They discovered that volcanic eruptions could affect global weather patterns, explaining the spectacular sunsets and temperature drops recorded worldwide in the months following the explosion. The atmospheric pressure measurements revealed the existence of what scientists now call infrasound, sound waves below the range of human hearing that can travel enormous distances. These low-frequency waves explained how the explosion had been heard at distances where the actual sound waves could never have reached. Animals, which can detect infrasound, had exhibited strange behaviour for hours before the main explosion, providing an early warning system that humans had been unable to interpret. Modern seismology and atmospheric science have confirmed that the 1883 eruption was one of the most powerful explosive events in human history. Satellite monitoring and computer modelling now allow scientists to track volcanic emissions around the globe in real time. The lessons learned from Krakatoa helped establish the science of volcanology and led to early warning systems that have saved countless lives in subsequent eruptions. Today, scientists monitor Anak Krakatau, the child of Krakatoa, which has grown from the underwater crater left by the 1883 explosion. Using modern instruments, they can detect the subtle signs that precede major eruptions, changes in gas emissions, ground deformation, and seismic activity. What once seemed like divine wrath or inexplicable natural phenomena can now be measured, predicted, and to some extent prepared for. The 1900 Galveston hurricane. On Saturday morning, September 8th, 1900, Louisa Rolfing stood at her kitchen window watching the waves. From her small 2-story house at 18th Street and Avenue O1/2, she could see the Gulf of Mexico in the distance, and something was wrong. The water looked angry, dark and churning in ways she had never seen before. Her husband August was getting ready to leave for work downtown, but Louisa felt a growing dread in her stomach. She begged him not to go. "Please stay home today," she pleaded. "Something terrible is coming." But August Rolfing had work to do. Like thousands of other Galveston residents that morning, he dismissed his wife's fears as feminine worry. The city had weathered storms before. Galveston was built to survive hurricanes. He kissed Louisa goodbye and headed into town, leaving her alone with their children and a sense of impending doom that grew stronger with each passing hour. 3 miles away, Isaac Klein was having his own moment of terrible realization. The chief meteorologist for the US Weather Bureau in Galveston, Klein had been tracking the storm for days. On paper, it looked manageable, a tropical disturbance moving northwest across the Gulf. But as he stood on the beach that morning, watching the massive swells rolling in from deep water, his scientific training told him something his instruments couldn't measure. These were not normal waves. They were the harbingers of a storm beyond anything in his experience. Klein had spent years studying weather patterns. He had published papers arguing that Galveston's gradual slope into the Gulf provided natural protection against storm surges. He had reassured residents many times that the island was safe. Now, as he watched waves crash over the beach and begin flooding the streets, he realized how catastrophically wrong he had been. The barometer in his office was dropping faster than he had ever seen. The wind was shifting in ominous patterns. Most terrifying of all, the tide was rising when it should have been falling. By noon, the situation had become critical. Klein commandeered a horse and wagon and began riding through the residential areas, warning people to evacuate to higher ground. But Galveston was a flat island. The highest point was barely 9 feet above sea level. There was nowhere to go except inland toward the bay, and even that was flooding as the storm surge pushed water in from all directions. At the Rolfing house, Louisa watched the water rise in their yard. First it covered the walkway, then crept up the front steps. Her children, 3 young ones who had been playing outside just hours before, pressed their faces against the windows in fascination and growing fear. When the water reached the first floor, Louisa made a desperate decision. She gathered the children and fled to her sister-in-law's house on higher ground, hoping it would be safer. She left everything behind. Photographs, letters, treasured possessions accumulated over years of marriage. She had no way of knowing if she would ever see her home again, or if August would be able to find them. Isaac Klein faced his own family crisis as the storm intensified. His brother Joseph, who worked as his assistant at the Weather Bureau, had joined Isaac at his house, along with other family members and neighbours seeking shelter. Isaac's house was well built and had survived every previous storm. It seemed like the safest place on the island. But as the afternoon wore on and the water continued rising, even Isaac began to doubt his own refuge. The wind reached terrifying speeds, over 100 miles per hour with gusts much higher. It howled like a living thing, tearing roofs from houses and turning debris into deadly projectiles. Street lamps bent and snapped. Telephone poles toppled like matchsticks. The sound was deafening, a constant roar punctuated by the crash of collapsing buildings and the screams of people trapped in the chaos. Joseph Klein later described the helplessness they felt watching the water rise around Isaac's house. "We could see other houses floating by," he wrote. "Some had people on their roofs calling for help that couldn't come. The water kept rising and we realized that even our solid house might not survive." The family moved to the second floor, then to the attic, carrying what supplies they could grab. Across the city, similar scenes of terror and survival played out in thousands of homes. Families climbed onto their roofs as their houses filled with water. Parents tied their children to floating debris, hoping someone might find them alive. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath the surge, which reached heights of 15 feet or more in some areas. The island that had been home to nearly 40,000 people was being systematically destroyed by wind and water. At the Rolfing family's refuge, the situation was becoming desperate. The sister-in-law's house, which had seemed safe that morning, was now surrounded by churning floodwater filled with debris from destroyed homes. Louisa held her children close as they listened to the house creak and groan under the storm's assault. Outside, they could hear the sounds of their city dying, timber splintering, glass shattering, and worst of all, human voices crying out in the darkness. Around 8 p.m, Isaac Klein's house finally succumbed to the storm. The structure that had sheltered his family and neighbours suddenly shifted and began to collapse. The house went down so suddenly that we barely had time to grasp floating timbers, Joseph Klein recalled. One moment we were in what seemed like safety, the next we were in the water, fighting for our lives. In the chaos of the collapse, Isaac lost sight of his pregnant wife Cora. The family was scattered across the churning floodwaters, clinging to whatever debris they could find. Isaac grabbed a piece of timber and searched frantically for his wife in the darkness, calling her name over the howling wind. He never found her alive. Cora Klein became one of the storm's thousands of victims, her body discovered days later among the wreckage. The storm finally began to weaken after midnight, but for the survivors, the nightmare was just beginning. As the waters receded, they revealed a landscape of unimaginable destruction. Entire city blocks had been swept clean. Houses that had stood for decades were reduced to scattered lumber. Bodies, thousands of them, lay trapped in the debris or washed up on the beaches. Louisa Rolfing and her children survived the night, though their ordeal was far from over. When dawn broke on September 9th, they emerged from their shelter to find a city that no longer existed. Streets they had walked daily were unrecognizable. Landmarks that had guided them through life had vanished. Most heartbreaking of all, there was no sign of August. Louisa spent days searching through the wreckage and refugee camps, desperate for news of her husband. Isaac Klein faced the devastating reality that his scientific confidence had contributed to the disaster. His reassurances about Galveston's safety had kept people from evacuating when they might have saved themselves. The Weather Bureau's failure to predict the storm's true intensity haunted him for the rest of his life. He threw himself into rescue work, helping organize the massive effort to clear debris and recover bodies. The human cost of the hurricane defied comprehension. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 6,000, but many believe the true number was closer to 10,000 or even 12,000. In a city of fewer than 40,000 residents, virtually everyone lost family members, friends, or neighbours. Entire families disappeared, leaving no one to search for them or mourn their passing. Recovery began immediately, driven by the extraordinary resilience of the survivors. Within days of the storm, volunteers from across Texas arrived to help clear debris and distribute supplies. The bodies of the dead were initially loaded onto barges and dumped at sea, but when they washed back to shore, the city organised mass funeral pyres that burned for weeks. August Rolfing was found alive several days after the storm, having taken shelter in a downtown building that partially survived. The reunion with Louisa and their children was joyful but bittersweet. They had each other, but they had lost everything else. Their house was gone, their possessions destroyed, their sense of security shattered forever. The disaster transformed not just Galveston, but the entire nation's understanding of natural disasters. It demonstrated the limits of 19th century meteorology and the need for better storm prediction and warning systems. The Weather Bureau, stung by criticism of its performance, began developing more sophisticated forecasting methods and communication networks. For Isaac Klein, the hurricane marked the end of one career and the beginning of another. Transferred to New Orleans, he spent the rest of his working life studying tropical storms and developing the science that would eventually save countless lives. His brother Joseph left Galveston shortly after the storm, unable to bear the memories. Both men carried the trauma of that night for the rest of their lives. The Armenian genocide, 1915 to 1923. The morning sun cast golden light across the cobblestone streets of Constantinople's Pera district in 1910. Hagop Hagopian stepped out of his elegant townhouse and breathed in the familiar scents of his neighbourhood: coffee from the cafes, spices from the markets, and the salt air from the Golden Horn. As one of the city's most successful Armenian merchants, Hagop owned 3 textile factories and employed over 200 workers. His children attended the finest schools, spoke multiple languages, and moved effortlessly between Armenian, Turkish, and European social circles. This was the height of Armenian prosperity in the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, Armenians had served as the empire's merchants, craftsmen, and civil servants. They were known as the faithful millet, a loyal minority that helped build Ottoman wealth and culture. In Constantinople alone, over 150,000 Armenians lived and worked alongside their Turkish, Greek, and Jewish neighbours. They owned banks, ran hospitals, published newspapers, and operated some of the empire's most successful businesses. Armenian families like the Hagopians had good reason to feel secure. They had survived the terrible massacres of the 1890s under Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 had promised a new era of equality and constitutional government. Armenian political parties emerged from underground. Armenian schools and churches reopened. The future seemed brighter than it had been in decades. But beneath this surface prosperity, dangerous currents were building. The Young Turk movement, officially called the Committee of Union and Progress, had initially welcomed Armenian participation in their vision of Ottoman renewal. However, as the empire suffered military defeats in the Balkans and lost territory to nationalist movements, the Young Turks' ideology began to shift toward an exclusive Turkish nationalism that had no place for minorities. The warning signs appeared gradually at first. In 1913, new laws restricted Armenian land ownership in eastern provinces. Government positions previously held by Armenians were quietly transferred to Turkish officials. Armenian schools faced increased scrutiny and regulation. Most ominously, the Young Turk leadership began speaking privately about the need to Turkify Anatolia and create a homogeneous Turkish state. By 1914, the rhetoric had become more open and threatening. Enver Pasha, one of the three Young Turk leaders, spoke publicly about solving the Armenian question once and for all. Turkish newspapers began publishing articles describing Armenians as a fifth column working with Russia against Ottoman interests. Local officials in eastern provinces received orders to compile lists of Armenian community leaders, intellectuals, and potential troublemakers. Hagop Hagopian and other prominent Armenians in Constantinople noticed these changes with growing unease. Business became more difficult as Turkish competitors received preferential treatment. Armenian employees reported harassment and threats. Longtime Turkish friends became distant and cold. The city's Armenian newspaper, Azadamad, was repeatedly censored and temporarily shut down for publishing articles deemed seditious. When World War I erupted in August 1914, the Ottoman Empire initially remained neutral. Many Armenians hoped the war would pass them by, or even provide opportunities as the empire modernized its military and economy. But when the Ottomans entered the war on Germany's side in November 1914, Armenian fears intensified. Russia was now the enemy, and Armenians were Orthodox Christians with historical ties to the Russian Empire. The crisis accelerated in early 1915, when Ottoman forces suffered devastating defeats against Russian armies in the Caucasus. Turkish military leaders, led by Enver Pasha, blamed these failures on Armenian treachery, rather than acknowledging their own strategic mistakes. Tales spread of Armenian soldiers deserting to the Russians and Armenian civilians, providing intelligence to enemy forces. Most of these stories were exaggerated or entirely false, but they provided the justification Young Turk leaders needed for more extreme measures. In March 1915, Interior Minister Talat Pasha began issuing secret orders to provincial governors. These telegrams, later discovered in Ottoman archives, outlined plans for the deportation of Armenians from strategic areas. The language was bureaucratic and euphemistic, but the intent was clear. Armenians were to be removed from their homes and relocated to distant regions where they could pose no threat to Ottoman security. The catastrophic event that changed everything occurred on the night of April 24th, 1915. Hagop Hagopian was sitting in his study reviewing business accounts when he heard sharp knocking at his front door. Turkish police officers stood outside with arrest warrants signed by the local governor. Hagop was accused of sedition and conspiracy against the state. Similar scenes played out across Constantinople as over 250 Armenian intellectuals, clergy, politicians and business leaders were arrested in a single coordinated operation. The arrests sent shockwaves through the Armenian community. These were not radical revolutionaries or suspected spies, but the most respected and established members of Armenian society. Doctors who had served Ottoman officials, teachers who had educated Turkish students, and merchants who had built their fortunes within the Ottoman system found themselves in prison cells alongside genuine political activists. Within days, most of the arrested men were loaded onto trains bound for the interior of Anatolia. They were told they would be held temporarily until the war ended and security concerns diminished. Their families received no information about their whereabouts or condition. In reality, almost all of these men were murdered within weeks of their arrest, shot or beaten to death in remote locations far from Constantinople. The cascading consequences began immediately. With Armenian community leaders eliminated, there was no organised resistance when deportation orders expanded to the general population. Starting in May 1915, Armenian families across the empire received notices giving them just days or hours to abandon their homes and report to collection points for temporary relocation. The deportations followed a systematic pattern designed to maximise suffering while maintaining plausible deniability. Families were separated, with men often killed immediately while women, children, and elderly were forced to march toward the Syrian desert. The routes deliberately avoided populated areas where witnesses might document the atrocities. Deportees were forbidden to take possessions beyond what they could carry, leaving behind homes, businesses, and lifetime savings. Turkish and Kurdish irregulars, organised by the government, attacked the deportation convoys systematically. Women and girls were abducted for sexual slavery. Children were kidnapped and forced to convert to Islam. The elderly and sick were simply abandoned to die by the roadside. Starvation and disease killed thousands more as the death marches continued for weeks across barren territory, with no provisions for food, water, or shelter. By autumn 1915, hundreds of thousands of Armenians had been murdered or had died during deportation. Entire regions that had been home to Armenian communities for over 1,000 years were empty of their former inhabitants. Churches were converted to mosques or destroyed entirely. Armenian schools and cultural institutions were closed permanently. Properties worth millions of pounds were distributed among Turkish citizens, sold at below-market prices to government supporters. The genocide continued through 1916 and beyond, expanding to target other Christian minorities including Assyrians and Greeks. Concentration camps in the Syrian desert became death camps where survivors of the deportations were systematically starved and murdered. International observers, including German allies, documented the atrocities, but their governments chose political expediency over humanitarian intervention. As the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1918, the genocide took new forms under the emerging Turkish nationalist movement led by Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk. Armenians who had survived the initial deportations or had lived in areas not yet affected faced new waves of persecution. The brief hope for justice when the Ottoman government was replaced proved illusory as the Turkish Independence War created new opportunities for ethnic cleansing. By 1923, when the modern Turkish state was established, the Armenian population of Anatolia had been reduced from nearly 2 million to fewer than 100,000. Ancient Armenian cities like Van, Erzurum, and Trebizond contained virtually no Armenians. The demographic transformation that young Turk ideologues had envisioned was complete. The international response to the Armenian genocide established precedents that would haunt the 20th century. While newspapers in Allied countries reported the atrocities, governments prioritized military victory over humanitarian concerns. The failure to hold perpetrators accountable emboldened future genocidaires, most notably Adolf Hitler, who famously asked, "Who remembers the Armenians?" when planning the Holocaust. The Spanish flu pandemic, 1918 to 1920. At 6:15 a.m. on March 4th, 1918, Private Albert Gitchell dragged himself to the camp hospital at Fort Riley, Kansas. The 28-year-old Army cook felt terrible. Fever, headache, muscle aches, and a bone-deep exhaustion that made even walking difficult. The camp doctor examined him quickly and wrote influenza on his chart. It seemed like a routine case of the flu that swept through military camps every winter. But Albert Gitchell had just become patient zero in the deadliest pandemic in human history. Within hours, the chain reaction had begun. Corporal Lee Drake arrived at the hospital with identical symptoms, then Private Adolph Herbie. By noon, dozens of soldiers were reporting sick. By the end of the week, over 500 men at Camp Funston were bedridden with the mysterious illness. What made this outbreak different was not just its speed, but its victims. These were not the usual flu casualties, elderly people and small children. These were healthy young men in the prime of their lives, soldiers training for deployment to the battlefields of Europe. The timing could not have been worse. World War I was raging in its final year, and the United States was mobilizing millions of men for combat. Military camps across America were overcrowded with recruits living in close quarters, sharing meals and breathing the same air in poorly ventilated barracks. The perfect conditions for a respiratory disease to spread like wildfire already existed. The virus simply needed to find them. From Camp Funston, the disease spread along the rails and roads that connected military installations across the country. Soldiers travelled between bases for training, officers moved from camp to camp. Within weeks, outbreaks were reported at military facilities from coast to coast. But the real acceleration came when infected troops began shipping out to Europe. Every troop ship became a floating incubator, carrying the virus across the Atlantic to Allied forces already weakened by years of brutal warfare. The first wave of the pandemic in spring 1918 was relatively mild. Soldiers got sick, recovered, and returned to duty. Military doctors noted the unusual spread but classified it as a severe seasonal flu. The war took priority over public health concerns. Troop movements continued on schedule. No one suspected they were witnessing the opening act of a global catastrophe. But the virus was mutating as it spread. Each new infection gave it another chance to change, to become more virulent, more deadly. By summer 1918, reports began reaching American military headquarters of a much more severe illness affecting Allied troops in Europe. British, French, and German forces were all experiencing devastating outbreaks of what seemed like a new disease entirely. Men were dying within hours of showing symptoms, their lungs filling with fluid, their faces turning blue from lack of oxygen. The second wave arrived in America in September 1918, and it was a monster. The virus had transformed from a manageable illness into a killing machine that targeted healthy adults with unprecedented fury. In Philadelphia, 12,000 people died in October alone. In Boston, bodies piled up faster than undertakers could bury them. The disease moved through communities like a scythe, cutting down entire families and leaving neighborhoods empty and silent. The pandemic's spread followed the arteries of modern civilization, railroads, shipping routes, and telegraph lines that connected the world's cities. From American ports, the virus traveled on commercial vessels to South America, where it devastated populations in Brazil and Argentina. British naval ships carried it to India, where it would claim more victims than anywhere else on Earth. Trading vessels spread it to Africa, where colonial populations with no previous exposure to influenza faced mortality rates of 20% or higher. In India, the disaster cascaded into multiple crises simultaneously. The flu killed an estimated 12 to 17 million people, but that was only the beginning. With so many agricultural workers dead or dying, crops rotted unharvested in the fields. The disruption of railway transport meant food could not reach areas that desperately needed it. The colonial administration, already strained by wartime demands, simply collapsed in many regions. Famine followed pandemic as the dead could no longer feed the living. The social breakdown created opportunities for secondary disasters. In India's crowded cities, sanitation systems failed as municipal workers died or fled. Cholera and other diseases spread through populations already weakened by influenza. Traditional social structures crumbled as entire families were wiped out, leaving children orphaned and elderly without care. The British colonial government, focused on the war effort, provided minimal assistance to the dying millions. Similar patterns emerged across the globe. In Iran, the pandemic killed an estimated 2 million people, nearly 20% of the population. The government ceased to function in many provinces. Bandits and warlords filled the power vacuum, leading to civil conflicts that killed thousands more. The economic disruption was so severe that Iran did not fully recover its pre-pandemic population for 2 decades. Africa experienced perhaps the most complete societal breakdown. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, mortality rates reached 30%. Entire villages were abandoned as survivors fled in terror. Agricultural systems collapsed as there were simply not enough people left to work the land. The disruption of trade routes led to shortages of basic goods. Colonial administrators reported regions where civilization itself seemed to have disappeared, leaving behind only empty huts and overgrown fields. The pandemic's effects on the global economy created a cascade of secondary crises. International trade plummeted as ports closed and shipping companies lost entire crews. Manufacturing slowed to a crawl as workers died or stayed home in fear. Financial markets collapsed as investors realized the scope of the disaster. The economic disruption contributed to the political upheavals that followed the war, including the Russian Revolution's final phase and the rise of radical movements across Europe. In the United States, the pandemic revealed and amplified existing social inequalities. Poor neighborhoods suffered disproportionately as overcrowded tenements became death traps. African American communities, already marginalized by segregation, received minimal medical care and experienced mortality rates far higher than white populations. The stress on healthcare systems exposed the inadequacy of public health infrastructure, leading to calls for reform that would influence American medicine for decades. The virus also demonstrated how quickly modern communication networks could spread panic along with disease. Newspapers carried reports of the mounting death tolls, creating fear that sometimes caused more damage than the virus itself. Rumours and misinformation spread as quickly as the pathogen, leading to everything from runs on banks to attacks on minority communities blamed for spreading the disease. By the time the pandemic finally burned itself out in 1920, it had fundamentally altered human civilization. Somewhere between 50 and 100 million people had died, more than the total military casualties of World War I. Entire communities had been erased from the map. Families had been torn apart. Political systems had collapsed. The economic disruption contributed to the global depression that followed, the Ukrainian Holodomor, 1932 to 1933. 9-year-old Miron Dolot crouched behind the wooden fence of his family's farmhouse in the village of Vinnytsia, Ukraine, watching something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 2 men in leather coats were walking through his neighbour's wheat field with long measuring sticks, calculating how much grain the family would be required to surrender to the state. His neighbour, old Petro, followed behind them, pleading, "Please, comrades, leave us something for winter. My grandchildren will starve." One of the men turned and struck Petro across the face with his clipboard. "The state needs grain more than your grandchildren need food." It was October 1932, and Miron was witnessing the beginning of what would become known as the Holodomor, the deliberate starvation of Ukraine by Stalin's Soviet regime. What the 9-year-old boy could not yet understand was that this scene would be repeated in thousands of villages across Ukraine, and that by the time it ended, millions of his countrymen would be dead. Miron's family had been prosperous farmers before collectivization. His grandfather owned 40 acres of fertile black soil, 3 horses, 2 cows, pigs and chickens. The family grew wheat, corn and vegetables enough to feed themselves and sell the surplus at market. They were what Soviet propaganda called kulaks, wealthy peasants who supposedly exploited their neighbours. In reality, they were simply hard-working farmers who had succeeded through their own labour. But success made them enemies of the state. In 1930, Soviet officials arrived in Vinnytsia to enforce collectivization. They seized the family's land, livestock and farm equipment, declaring it all property of the newly formed collective farm. Miron's grandfather was given the choice: join the collective or be deported to Siberia as an enemy of the people. He chose to stay and work the land his family had farmed for generations, now as a labourer on his own former property. The real horror began in 1932 when Stalin decided to break Ukrainian resistance to Soviet rule through starvation. Impossible grain quotas were imposed on collective farms throughout Ukraine. Even when these quotas exceeded the total harvest, local officials were ordered to collect every kernel. "Better that half the population die than we fail to meet the grain delivery targets," one regional party secretary told his subordinates, according to survivors who overheard the meeting. Miron watched as the horror unfolded day by day. Armed brigades swept through villages, searching every house for hidden grain. They used long metal rods to probe the ground for buried food. They brought trained dogs to sniff out concealed stores. Anyone caught hiding even a handful of wheat faced immediate execution or deportation. His own family's meagre reserves, a few sacks of grain his mother had hidden in the cellar, were discovered and confiscated in November 1932. The searches were conducted with sadistic thoroughness. Maria Zarakhnaya, a survivor from the village of Terny, later testified about watching officials tear apart her neighbour's houseboard by board looking for grain. "They found nothing because there was nothing to find," she recalled. But they beat the man anyway for wasting their time. His wife begged them to leave her children something to eat. They laughed and said children who couldn't work didn't deserve food. By December 1932, the famine had begun in earnest. Miron's family started each day with a piece of bark bread, ground tree bark mixed with whatever weeds and grass they could find. His little sister cried constantly from hunger pains. His grandmother, weakened by months of inadequate food, developed the swollen limbs that marked the first stage of starvation. The village that had once been filled with the sounds of children playing and farmers working fell silent, except for the moaning of the dying. The winter of 1932 to 1933 brought unimaginable suffering. Miron later wrote about walking through his village and seeing houses where entire families had died. The silence was the worst part, he remembered. No crying babies, no barking dogs, no sound of life at all. Just the wind blowing through broken windows and the smell of death everywhere. Desperate people resorted to eating anything they could find. They boiled leather boots and belts for soup. They made bread from ground bones and sawdust. Some turned to cannibalism, first eating the bodies of those who had already died, then killing the weak to feed the strong. Miron witnessed a neighbour woman arrested for killing and eating her own child. She wasn't a monster, he later wrote. She was a loving mother driven insane by hunger. Soviet authorities deliberately prevented help from reaching the starving. They established roadblocks around Ukraine to stop people from fleeing to areas with food. Internal passports were required for travel, and starving peasants could not obtain them. Armed guards were stationed at railway stations to turn back refugees. The borders of Ukraine became a prison wall, sealing millions inside to die. Maria Zarakhnaya attempted to walk to the nearest city to find work and food for her family. She was turned back at a checkpoint just 15 miles from her village. The guard looked at me with contempt, she recalled. He said, "Go back and die where you belong, Kulak pig." I begged him to let me pass, told him my children were dying. He just laughed and pointed his rifle at me. International aid was rejected. The Soviet government denied that any famine existed. Foreign journalists who tried to report the truth were expelled from the country. Walter Duranty of the New York Times, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting from Moscow, wrote articles claiming Ukrainian peasants were fat and happy, while millions were dying just miles from where he filed his stories. Miron's grandmother died in February 1933, her body so wasted by starvation that she weighed less than his 10-year-old sister. They had no wood for a coffin, so they wrapped her in a sheet and buried her in the frozen ground behind their house. His little sister followed 2 weeks later, her 7-year-old body finally giving up its fight against hunger. She died in my arms, Miron wrote decades later. Her last words were asking for just one piece of bread. Spring 1933 brought the worst period of the famine. The new growing season should have brought hope, but seed grain had been confiscated along with food supplies. Fields lay barren while people continued to die in massive numbers. Entire villages were depopulated. In some regions, mortality reached 70%. The dead were so numerous that survivors lacked the strength to bury them properly. Bodies lay in streets and fields, creating health hazards that killed even more people. Yet some survived through courage, luck, and the kindness of strangers. Miron's family endured because his mother had hidden a small amount of gold jewellery that she traded for food on the black market. Each transaction risked execution, but she had no choice. A Russian factory worker, moved by pity, occasionally brought them scraps of bread when he visited the village on official business. These tiny acts of humanity saved their lives. By summer 1933, the worst was over. A new harvest provided food for the survivors, though rationing continued for months. But the damage to Ukrainian society was irreversible. Entire communities had vanished. Traditional culture had been devastated as the elderly keepers of customs and language died. The social fabric that had held rural communities together for centuries was destroyed. Miron grew up carrying the trauma of what he'd witnessed. Like other survivors, he learned to never speak publicly about the famine. Soviet authorities classified any discussion of the Holodomor as anti-state propaganda punishable by imprisonment or death. Families whispered their memories to children and grandchildren, but public acknowledgement was forbidden. Only after immigrating to the United States decades later could Miron finally tell his story. His memoir, Execution by Hunger, became one of the first detailed accounts of the Holodomor to reach Western audiences. But even then, many dismissed Ukrainian survivors' testimonies as Cold War propaganda or exaggerated folk memories. The full truth emerged only after Ukrainian independence in 1991, when Soviet archives were opened and survivors could speak freely. Demographic studies confirmed what survivors had always known: between 3.5 and 5 million Ukrainians died in the artificial famine of 1932 to 1933. The Holodomor was revealed as genocide, a deliberate attempt to destroy Ukrainian national identity by starving the people who carried it. World War II, 1939 to 1945. The summer of 1938 had been glorious across Europe. In London, families picnicked in Hyde Park while children played cricket on village greens throughout England. Parisians strolled along the Seine, enjoying cafe culture and the gentle rhythms of peacetime. Even in Germany, despite the political tensions, ordinary citizens went about their daily lives, shopping in Berlin's department stores, attending concerts in Vienna's grand halls, and planning holidays in the Bavarian countryside. The Great War had ended 20 years earlier, and most Europeans believed they had learned enough from that catastrophe to never repeat it. This was the height of what historians would later call the long peace of the 1930s. Industrial production was recovering from the Depression. New technologies like radio and cinema were transforming popular culture. Air travel was making the world smaller, while international trade was binding nations together in webs of economic cooperation. The League of Nations, despite its flaws, offered hope that diplomacy could resolve conflicts before they escalated to warfare. Most people across the continent believed they were living in a new age of civilization and progress. In Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain embodied this optimism. He genuinely believed that reasonable men could solve any dispute through negotiation. When he returned from Munich in September 1938, waving the agreement that gave Hitler the Sudetenland, millions of Europeans felt profound relief. War had been averted through diplomatic compromise. Chamberlain's promise of peace for our time reflected what most people desperately wanted to believe, that the civilized world had moved beyond the barbarism of total war. But the warning signs had been building for years, visible to anyone willing to see them. In March 1936, Hitler had remilitarized the Rhineland, directly violating the Treaty of Versailles. European leaders protested but took no action. The precedent was set. Aggression would be met with words, not force. In March 1938, German troops marched into Austria and were welcomed with flowers and cheering crowds. The Anschluss absorbed an entire nation into the German Reich, but European leaders convinced themselves it was merely Germans reuniting with Germans. Each concession emboldened Hitler further. The Munich Agreement of September 1938 dismembered Czechoslovakia, handing over the Sudetenland to Germany without consulting the Czech government. Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier told themselves they were preventing war by appeasing Hitler's territorial demands. They chose to believe his promises that the Sudetenland was his last territorial claim in Europe. But within 6 months, German tanks rolled through Prague, occupying the remainder of Czechoslovakia and demonstrating that Hitler's appetite for conquest knew no limits. The signs multiplied throughout 1938 and early 1939. Germany's military spending reached unprecedented levels, consuming over 20% of the national budget. New weapons factories opened across the Reich while millions of men received military training. The Nazi press began preparing the German people psychologically for war, describing neighbouring countries as threats to German security and survival. International observers noted the massive build-up but hoped it was merely political theatre, designed to extract diplomatic concessions. More ominously, the Nazi regime began implementing policies that revealed its true nature. The November 1938 Kristallnacht pogrom saw organised attacks on Jewish businesses, synagogues and homes throughout Germany and Austria. The world watched in horror as windows were smashed, buildings burned, and thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. This state-sponsored violence demonstrated that Nazi Germany was becoming something fundamentally different from a normal European nation, a regime that viewed entire populations as enemies to be eliminated. The final warning came in August 1939 with the announcement of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Hitler and Stalin, supposedly ideological enemies, signed a non-aggression agreement that secretly divided Poland between their two nations. This cynical alliance removed the possibility of a two-front war that had constrained German ambitions in 1914. With the Soviet Union neutralized, Hitler was free to attack Western Europe without fear of Russian intervention. The catastrophic event that shattered the peace occurred at 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939. German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish fortress of Westerplatte near Danzig. Simultaneously, 1.5 million German troops crossed the Polish border along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to Slovakia. Hitler's Wehrmacht employed a new form of warfare called Blitzkrieg, lightning war that combined tanks, aircraft and motorized infantry in coordinated assaults designed to paralyze enemy resistance before it could organize. The invasion of Poland was not just another territorial grab, but the beginning of a completely new kind of conflict. German forces deliberately targeted civilians, bombing refugee columns and destroying hospitals and schools. SS units followed the advancing army, executing Polish intellectuals, clergy and political leaders in a systematic attempt to decapitate Polish society. This was not war in the traditional European sense, but something approaching genocide, the deliberate destruction of entire nations and peoples. Britain and France honoured their guarantees to Poland and declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. But they could do little to help their ally. The phony war that followed saw minimal fighting in Western Europe, while Poland was crushed between German and Soviet forces. By October 1939, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent state, divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The speed and brutality of the conquest shocked European leaders who had assumed modern warfare would resemble the static trench fighting of 1914 to 1918. The cascading consequences began immediately. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, demonstrating that neutrality offered no protection from Nazi aggression. The following month, German forces launched their assault on France, Belgium, Holland and Luxembourg. The supposedly impregnable Maginot Line was bypassed as German tanks raced through the Ardennes forest, reaching the English Channel in just 10 days. France, the great military power that had helped defeat Germany in 1918, collapsed in 6 weeks. Britain now stood alone against the Nazi Empire that controlled most of Europe. The Battle of Britain in summer 1940 saw German bombers attempting to destroy the Royal Air Force as preparation for invasion. When this failed, the Blitz began, sustained bombing of British cities designed to break civilian morale. London, Coventry, Birmingham and other cities endured nightly raids that killed thousands and destroyed vast areas of urban Britain. The war expanded beyond Europe as Hitler's allies joined the conflict. Italy entered the war in June 1940, opening new fronts in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Japan, already fighting in China since 1937, allied with Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact. The conflict that had begun with the invasion of Poland was becoming a truly global war involving most of the world's major powers. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941 marked another escalation in the war's scope and brutality. Operation Barbarossa involved over 3 million Axis troops in the largest military operation in history. But this was not merely conquest, it was a war of racial extermination. Nazi ideology viewed Slavs as subhuman and planned to enslave or eliminate most of Eastern Europe's population. The invasion triggered mass murder on unprecedented scale as SS units and collaborators systematically killed Jews, communists and other targeted groups. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the United States fully into the conflict, creating a truly global war spanning every continent and ocean. What had begun as a European border dispute had become a struggle for the future of human civilization. The Axis powers sought to create a world order based on racial hierarchy and totalitarian control, while the Allies fought to preserve democracy and human rights. The long-term aftermath of World War II reshaped virtually every aspect of human society. The death toll exceeded 70 million people, making it the deadliest conflict in human history. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, national economies collapsed, and traditional social structures were destroyed. The war revealed the full horror of industrialized genocide in the Holocaust, and demonstrated humanity's capacity for both unprecedented evil and remarkable resilience. 20 terrible periods, hundreds of millions dead, entire civilizations erased from the map. After witnessing humanity's darkest moments, one question remains. What did we learn? We learned that civilization is more fragile than we want to admit. Cities that took centuries to build burned in hours. Empires that ruled for generations collapsed in months. Social bonds that seemed unbreakable snapped under pressure. The veneer of civilization is thin, and beneath it lies something much more primitive. History's darkest chapters teach us that hope and horror walk hand in hand through the human experience. The choice of which one defines our future remains ours to make.